Long before the first dinosaur ever set foot on solid ground, long before the forests rose and the mountains took their shapes, long before a single bird called out across an open sky, the earth was already ancient. It was already scarred, already shaped by forces so immense and so slow that no human mind can fully absorb their scale. And in the depths of its primordial oceans, in the cold silence of waters that had never known a human eye, life was already doing what life does best. It was experimenting, it was reaching. It was fighting, drifting, hunting, hiding, and dying in ways that would never be repeated again anywhere in the history of this planet. This is not the story of dinosaurs. This is the story that came before, a story older and in many ways stranger than anything the age of dinosaurs would ever produce. This is the story of creatures so bizarre that when scientists first uncovered their fossils, they could not agree on which end was the head and which was the tail. This is the story of oceans that teemed with life forms so alien to our modern sensibilities that they seem more like the products of imagination than the products of natural selection. This is the story of the first predators, the first eyes, the first legs, the first breath of open air drawn by a creature crawling out of the water onto dry land, trembling, gasping, and changing the world forever. We are going on a journey. Not measured in miles or kilometers, but in hundreds of millions of years. We are going back to the very beginning of complex life on this planet, to a time when the rules of survival had not yet been written, when evolution was casting the widest possible net, trying every conceivable shape and strategy and body plan to see what would stick. We are going to meet the monsters and the miracles of the ancient world. We are going to witness the dawn of ecosystems, the rise of the first great predators, the slow crawl of life onto land, and the ultimate catastrophe that nearly erased everything before life came back, stubborn and unstoppable, to begin again. Sit back, take a breath, because what you are about to discover will fundamentally change the way you think about the living world around you. To understand the creatures we are going to meet, we must first understand the world they inhabited. And to understand that world, we have to stretch our imaginations to a breaking point, because the Earth of 500 million years ago was not merely a different place from the one we know today. It was, in almost every meaningful sense, a different planet. The continents as we recognize them did not exist. The familiar shapes of the land masses, the silhouettes that we have memorized on maps that we can sketch from memory, were hundreds of millions of years away from taking form. Instead, the land was arranged in configurations that would be unrecognizable to any modern traveler. Great shallow seas spread across what would one day become dry land. The atmosphere held less oxygen than it does today. The chemistry of the oceans was different. The temperatures fluctuated in patterns driven by geological forces operating on timescales that make human civilization feel like the blink of an eye. And yet, in those alien oceans, something extraordinary was already underway. For the first 3 billion years or so of Earth's existence, life was almost exclusively microbial. Bacteria and single-celled organisms dominated every environment. They were everywhere and they were successful, extraordinarily so, but they were invisible to the naked eye, and they left no trace in the fossil record that would allow us to reconstruct anything like a narrative. Life, in those unimaginably ancient days, was essentially a chemistry experiment running at a planetary scale. But then, approximately 600 million years ago, something shifted. The pace of evolutionary change accelerated in ways that scientists are still working to fully understand. Multicellular organisms began to appear with greater frequency and complexity. Life began to take on visible forms. And by around 540 million years ago, in a geological period we call the Cambrian, the fossil record explodes with evidence of creatures so diverse, so varied, so anatomically inventive, that scientists gave this moment in time a name that captures its breathtaking scope. They called it the Cambrian Explosion. An explosion is exactly the right word. In geological terms, though it still unfolded over millions of years, periods of time that dwarf anything in human experience, the emergence of complex, diverse, visible life happened with astonishing rapidity. It is as though evolution had been saving up its ideas, holding them in reserve, and then suddenly released them all at once in a burst of creative energy unlike anything before or since. The oceans of the Cambrian period were unlike any ocean that exists today. They were warm in many places, shallow across vast continental shelves, and filled with a biochemical richness that supported an explosion of new life strategies. But they were also fundamentally different in one crucial and defining way. The food chains and predator-prey relationships that govern every modern ecosystem were still being invented. There were no established rules. There were no dominant body plans that had proven themselves across geological time. There were no templates, no blueprints, no evolutionary precedents to follow. Every creature living in those Cambrian seas was, in a very real sense, a first draft. And it is in this context, this wide-open, experimental, rule-free world of the ancient Cambrian Ocean, that we meet the first of our extraordinary characters. Imagine you are suspended in the water column of a Cambrian sea, 520 million years ago. The light filters down from the surface in shifting curtains of pale blue and green. The seafloor below you is carpeted with strange, feathery organisms anchored to the substrate filter feeders, most of them waving in the gentle current, harvesting whatever drifts into their reach. Small, soft-bodied creatures drift past you, some resembling worms, others having no modern analog whatsoever. The water itself is alive with microscopic organisms, the base of a food chain that is still finding its shape. And then from somewhere above you in the water column something moves. It does not drift. It does not wave passively in the current. It moves with intention, with direction, with purpose. Two long, flexible appendages extend from the front of its body, each one segmented, each one capable of precise and powerful movement. Its mouth, when it opens, reveals a circular arrangement of hard, tooth-like plates, capable of crushing the shells of the organisms it pursues. Its body undulates with a fluid, rippling motion that drives it through the water with surprising speed, and its eyes, its enormous, stalked, compound eyes, are scanning the water around it, processing visual information with a sophistication that nothing else in this ancient sea can match. This is Anomalocaris. And in the Cambrian oceans, there is nothing else quite like it. The name Anomalocaris translates roughly from its Latin and Greek roots as abnormal shrimp, and the name has a history attached to it that is itself a fascinating story. When paleontologists first began recovering the fossils of this creature in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they made a mistake that would persist in the scientific literature for decades. The various body parts of Anomalocaris were so different from one another, and so different from anything living, that when researchers found different parts of the same animal in different locations, they classified each part as a completely separate organism. The circular mouth was initially described as a jellyfish. The feeding appendages were classified as the body of a shrimp, an abnormal shrimp, hence the name that eventually stuck to the whole creature. The body itself was identified as yet another animal. It was not until the 1980s, when researchers at the famous Burgess Shale deposits in what is now Western Canada were able to examine more complete specimens, that the full picture emerged. These were not three separate animals. They were three parts of one extraordinary animal, the largest predator in the Cambrian seas, and what an animal it was. Anomalocaris could reach lengths of up to a meter, remarkable in a world where most other animals measured in centimeters. Some specimens suggest that certain individuals may have grown considerably larger, but size alone does not capture what made this creature so significant in the story of life on Earth. What made Anomalocaris truly revolutionary was the combination of capabilities it possessed, capabilities that represented a quantum leap in the complexity of predatory behavior. Those feeding appendages, the structures that had been mistakenly classified as a separate shrimp species, were extraordinary instruments. Each one was composed of multiple segments, flexible and articulated, capable of sweeping through the water to capture prey, to manipulate and position food items for the circular mouth. They were essentially the first sophisticated predatory tools in the history of visible life, structures specifically designed not merely to receive food, but to actively seek it, capture it, and process it. This is a distinction that might seem subtle, but that carries enormous implications for the evolution of predator-prey relationships, and by extension, for the entire trajectory of life on Earth. But perhaps even more significant than those remarkable appendages were the eyes. The eyes of Anomalocaris were large, compound, and mounted on stalks, structures that gave the animal an extraordinarily wide field of view. And recent research, some of it conducted in the last decade or so, has revealed just how sophisticated these eyes actually were. The compound eyes of Anomalocaris contained thousands of individual lenses, arranged in a pattern remarkably similar to the compound eyes of modern insects and crustaceans, creatures that are, of course, vastly more recent in evolutionary terms. This discovery sent a ripple of excitement through the paleontological community because it revealed something profound about the early history of vision. The optical systems in Anomalocaris were not crude, primitive light detectors. They were high-resolution imaging devices, capable of forming detailed pictures of the surrounding environment. In a world where most other organisms either lacked eyes entirely or possessed only the simplest possible light-sensing structures, Anomalocaris was seeing the world with a clarity and detail that its prey could not match. Think about what that means in terms of predator-prey dynamics. Vision, true, detailed, directional vision, is one of the most powerful survival tools in the natural world. The ability to detect prey from a distance, to track its movement, to judge its distance and size before committing to an attack, these capabilities transform hunting from a chance encounter into a strategic pursuit. And in the Cambrian seas, where nothing else had eyes of comparable quality, Anomalocaris was essentially hunting in a world of the blind. The advantage this conferred was staggering. While other organisms relied on chemical signals, touch, or the most rudimentary light sensitivity to navigate their environment, Anomalocaris could see. It could identify prey. It could pursue and intercept. It could, in a very real sense, plan its attacks in ways that its prey were incapable of countering or even anticipating. What did Anomalocaris eat? This question has generated considerable scientific debate, and the answers are more nuanced than they might first appear. The early assumption was that the circular, crushing mouth was designed for attacking hard-shelled prey, breaking open the protective cases of armored animals. And the evidence does suggest that Anomalocaris regularly consumed such prey. Fossils have been found showing the distinctive marks of Anomalocaris feeding on trilobites, those armored, multi-segmented creatures that would become one of the most iconic and enduring groups in the Cambrian seas. But more recent analysis of the mouthparts has complicated this picture. Some researchers have argued that the circular mouth may not have been as rigid and crushing as initially believed, that it may not have been fully capable of the powerful bite originally assumed. This has led to suggestions that Anomalocaris may have been a more flexible feeder than previously thought, capable of consuming softer prey as well as harder-shelled animals. Some scientists have even proposed that certain species of Anomalocaris may have been filter feeders, using their appendages to sweep through the water and collect small organisms rather than actively hunting large prey. This ongoing scientific debate is itself instructive. It reminds us that the ancient world was not simple, and the creatures that inhabited it were not simple either. Even the most iconic predator of the Cambrian period turns out, on closer examination, to be a more complex and varied creature than our first impressions suggest. What we can say with confidence is that Anomalocaris represented the pinnacle of predatory sophistication in the Cambrian world. For tens of millions of years, it occupied the apex of marine food chains. It was the largest, most visually capable, most mobile predator in a world that was still working out what predation even meant. And its existence had consequences that rippled through the entire ecosystem, driving the evolution of defensive strategies in its prey and shaping the trajectory of animal evolution in ways that we are still working to fully understand. But Anomalocaris was not alone in those extraordinary Cambrian seas. The waters of this ancient world were populated by a cast of creatures so varied, so strange, so fundamentally unlike anything alive today, that their discovery has repeatedly forced scientists to rethink their assumptions about the range of possible body plans that evolution can produce. To truly appreciate the strangeness of the Cambrian fauna, the collection of organisms that inhabited these ancient waters, it helps to understand what we mean when we talk about body plans. A body plan in biological terms is the fundamental organizational scheme of an animal's anatomy. It determines how many body segments there are, where the limbs are positioned, how the digestive system is oriented, where the sensory organs are located. Modern animals, despite their tremendous diversity, all belong to a relatively small number of basic body plan categories. Vertebrates, animals with a backbone, share one fundamental body plan. Arthropods, insects, crustaceans, spiders, and their relatives share another. Mollusks, echinoderms, and annelid worms each represent their own distinct body plan categories. The point is that today, despite the enormous variety of life on Earth, the range of fundamental body plan variations is relatively constrained. Evolution has settled over hundreds of millions of years on a limited toolkit of organizational schemes, and virtually all living animals are variations on those themes. In the Cambrian period, this was not yet the case. The evolutionary experiment was still wide open. Body plans that would later prove unsuccessful or that led to evolutionary dead ends were just as viable as the plans that would eventually give rise to the modern animal kingdom. The Cambrian seas were full of creatures operating on organizational principles that would not survive to the present day. And some of these creatures were so strange that they challenge our ability to even describe them using familiar biological terms. Consider the creature known as hallucigenia. When the fossils of hallucigenia were first described in the 1970s, the scientist who named it, Simon Conway Morris, chose that name deliberately. Hallucigenia because the creature seemed to him like something from a hallucination, a dream animal, something that could not possibly be real. And looking at those early reconstructions, it is easy to understand why he felt that way. Hallucigenia was a small creature. Most specimens measure only a few centimeters in length, but its proportions were baffling. It appeared to have 2 rows of rigid spines along one side of its body and a row of soft, flexible tentacles along the other. When Conway Morris first attempted a reconstruction, he placed the animal walking on its spines, using the rigid structures as legs, with the tentacles waving above its back. The result was an image that genuinely looked like a creature from a nightmare or a fever dream, a tiny alien walking on stilts with soft tendrils reaching up toward the sky. For years, this reconstruction stood as the accepted interpretation of hallucigenia's anatomy. And then scientists realized something extraordinary. They had the animal completely upside down. The spines were not legs at all. They were defensive structures on the animal's back, pointed, rigid projections designed to deter predators. The actual legs of hallucigenia were the soft, flexible structures that had previously been interpreted as dorsal tentacles. When the animal was flipped right side up, it became a creature walking on multiple pairs of soft, stubby limbs, with a defensive armament of sharp spines protecting its back. But the confusion did not end there. For a long time, scientists were not certain which end of hallucigenia was the head and which was the tail. Some specimens appeared to have a small, circular structure at one end that might be a head, but the identification remained uncertain. It was only relatively recently, through the examination of exquisitely preserved specimens from deposits in China, that researchers were able to identify the head of hallucigenia with confidence. And they discovered something wonderful. The head bore a pair of simple eyes and a circular mouth ringed with tiny teeth. Even the throat of hallucigenia was lined with teeth, a feature so unusual that it prompted considerable scientific excitement. Why does hallucigenia matter? Because it represents one of the great puzzles and one of the great insights in the history of paleontology. This strange little creature, once thought to be too bizarre to place in any known animal group, turned out to be a distant, ancient relative, but a relative nonetheless of the velvet worms, the onychophorans that still live today in certain tropical environments. Hallucigenia, in other words, is not entirely without modern descendants. Its body plan, as strange as it appeared to early researchers, was a variation on a theme that would persist, modified and refined into the present day. The lesson of hallucigenia is humility. It is a reminder that our first impressions of the ancient world are often wrong, that the creatures of the past operated on principles we may not immediately recognize, and that patient, careful scientific work can eventually reveal connections and relationships that initially seem impossible. Among the gallery of Cambrian wonders, one creature stands out for a reason that has nothing to do with its fearsome predatory capabilities or its exotic defensive armament. It stands out because it is, in a peculiar way, almost charming, and because it presents one of the most tantalizing evolutionary puzzles in the entire history of paleontology. That creature is Opabinia. Opabinia was a small predator, typically around 5 to 8 centimeters in length, that navigated the Cambrian seas on multiple pairs of lateral lobes, structures that function something like fins or paddles, providing both propulsion and stability. Its body was elongated and segmented, with a tail fan at the rear that added to its overall graceful appearance. In isolation, any of these features might have been unremarkable, but the front end of Opabinia was something else entirely. The head of Opabinia bore 5 eyes, not 2, not the compound clusters of multiple lenses that we see in modern insects and crustaceans. 5 separate, distinct eyes arranged across the top of the head, each presumably providing visual information about a different portion of the animal's surroundings. 5 eyes. Even among the extraordinary diversity of Cambrian body plans, 5 eyes is unusual enough to stop you in your tracks. But the eyes were not even the most striking feature of Opabinia's anatomy. Extending from the front of the animal's head was a long, flexible proboscis, a tubular appendage that bore a grasping claw at its tip. This proboscis could presumably be used to reach out and seize prey, bringing it back to the mouth, which was located on the underside of the head rather than at the tip of the appendage. Opabinia essentially had a built-in reaching arm extending from its face, equipped with a claw, used to retrieve food and deliver it to a mouth positioned inconveniently behind it. The first time a formal reconstruction of Opabinia was presented to a meeting of paleontologists in 1972, the audience reportedly laughed, not in mockery, but in sheer delighted astonishment. Here was an animal so improbable, so unlikely, so perfectly capturing the spirit of Cambrian evolutionary experimentation that the only appropriate response was laughter. But Opabinia was real. Its fossils are not common, but they are real, preserved in the exquisite detail that the Burgess Shale so remarkably provides. And it swam through the Cambrian seas for millions of years, apparently quite successfully, navigating an environment where its 5 eyes gave it a panoramic view of the world and its grasping proboscis allowed it to exploit prey items that other predators could not easily reach. Where does Opabinia fit in the tree of life? This is a question that paleontologists have wrestled with for decades, and the debate is not fully resolved. Opabinia appears to be related to the broader group that includes Anomalocaris and, more distantly, to the arthropods, the vast group that today includes all insects, crustaceans, spiders, and their relatives. It may represent an early branch of what would eventually become the arthropod lineage, a body plan experiment that explored some of the same anatomical territory as the arthropods but ultimately did not give rise to any surviving descendants. In other words, Opabinia may be an evolutionary dead end, a magnificent, 5-eyed dead end, but a dead end nonetheless. And there is something poignant about that. This remarkable creature, with its panoramic vision and its extraordinary reaching arm, lived and thrived and hunted and was eaten, played its role in an ancient ecosystem, and then disappeared without leaving any direct descendants in the modern world. The Cambrian period was full of such experiments. full of creatures that were real, that were successful for their time, that played important roles in the ecological web of the ancient world, and that nevertheless left no living descendants. They were the roads not taken in the grand map of evolution, the brilliant solutions to problems that turned out, in the fullness of geological time, to be the wrong problems. The Burgess Shale deposit, which has provided so many of the fossils we have been discussing, deserves a moment of attention in its own right. Because the story of how it was discovered and what it revealed about the ancient world is itself one of the great narratives in the history of science. The Burgess Shale was discovered in 1909 by Charles Walcott, a paleontologist who was, at the time, serving as secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. Walcott was conducting field work in the mountains of Western Canada when he came across an extraordinary deposit of fossils, soft-bodied organisms preserved with a degree of detail that had never previously been seen in Cambrian age rocks. Typically, the Cambrian fossil record consists almost entirely of hard parts, shells, teeth, mineralized skeletons. The soft bodies of Cambrian animals, being much more susceptible to decay, almost never survive long enough to be fossilized. But at the site Walcott discovered, a combination of unusual geological circumstances had conspired to create conditions in which soft tissues were preserved with astonishing fidelity. Eyes, guts, muscles, appendages, all the delicate anatomical details that normally vanish without a trace, were captured here in remarkable detail. Walcott collected thousands of specimens over many years of field work, and he published descriptions of many of them. But his interpretations were significantly constrained by the scientific framework of his time. Walcott tended to force the Cambrian animals he found into the categories of modern animal groups, interpreting them as early versions of known creatures rather than recognizing them as fundamentally different body plans. He saw what he expected to see, which is a deeply human tendency, and his classifications persisted in the scientific literature for decades. It was not until the 1960s and 1970s, when researchers including Harry Whittington, Simon Conway Morris, and Derek Briggs undertook a systematic re-examination of Walcott's specimens, that the true strangeness of the Burgess Shale fauna began to emerge. These researchers looked at the fossils with fresh eyes, without the preconception that they must belong to known animal groups, and what they found changed paleontology forever. What they found was a world of evolutionary experimentation without precedent, a diversity of body plans that went far beyond anything that survived to the present day. They found Anomalocaris, Hallucigenia, Opabinia, and dozens of other creatures that could not be neatly assigned to any modern animal group. They found evidence that the Cambrian period was not simply the beginning of the modern animal kingdom, but was a time of far broader biological experimentation, a time when the range of possible body plans was vastly greater than it is today. The implications were profound and controversial. If the Cambrian period produced such a wide range of body plans, most of which did not survive, then the history of life is not simply a story of progressive improvement and diversification. It is also a story of loss, of evolutionary possibilities that were explored and then abandoned, of body plans that were viable and real, but that nevertheless did not make it through the biological filters of geological time. This insight, developed most comprehensively by the writer Stephen Jay Gould in his influential book Wonderful Life, suggested that the history of life has a strong element of contingency, of chance. If different organisms had survived the various mass extinctions and environmental upheavals of the past, the living world might look very different from the one we know. The animals of the modern world are not the inevitable products of a directed evolutionary process. They are the survivors, the lucky ones, from a much broader cast of characters. But we must not lose ourselves entirely in the philosophical implications of the Cambrian period. There are more creatures to meet, and the story of these ancient oceans has barely begun. As we move forward in geological time from the height of the Cambrian, past 500 million years ago, through the Ordovician and Silurian periods into the Devonian, the character of marine life changes. The wild, experimental diversity of the Cambrian gives way to something that, while still extraordinarily different from the modern world, begins to show the first signs of the familiar organizational themes that will eventually dominate. The arthropods, the group whose roots extend back into the Cambrian period, begin to emerge as a consistently dominant force in marine ecosystems. The trilobites, those distinctive armored creatures with their segmented bodies and compound eyes, diversify into hundreds of species and spread into virtually every marine environment available to them. They become so abundant that their fossils are among the most commonly found in Paleozoic rocks worldwide, beautifully preserved, often extraordinarily detailed, and so varied in form that their study alone could occupy a paleontologist's entire career. The trilobites are worth dwelling on for a moment because they represent something important in our story. They were not apex predators. They were not the largest or the most visually spectacular creatures in the ancient oceans, but they were extraordinarily successful, and their success tells us something fundamental about the ecology of the early marine world. Most trilobites were bottom dwellers, crawling across the seafloor in search of food. Some were scavengers, consuming organic debris. Others were predators of smaller organisms. Still others were filter feeders, harvesting microorganisms from the water. The diversity of their feeding strategies mirrored the diversity of their physical forms. Some were tiny, flat, and smooth. Others were large and heavily armored, studded with spines and projections that provided both structural support and defensive protection. And they had eyes, compound eyes in many cases of remarkable sophistication. Trilobite eyes are among the earliest and best preserved examples of optical systems in the fossil record, and they reveal a fascinating picture of the evolution of vision. The lenses in trilobite eyes were made not of soft tissue, as in most modern eyes, but of calcite, the same mineral that makes up limestone. This gave them an extraordinary resistance to decay, which is why trilobite eyes are preserved so often and so well. And the optical properties of calcite lenses are actually quite good. Modern analysis has shown that some trilobite eyes were capable of forming clear images with remarkably little distortion. Why does any of this matter for our story? Because vision, the ability to form detailed images of the surrounding environment, is one of the great transformative innovations in the history of life. And the development of sophisticated visual systems in creatures like Anomalocaris and the trilobites marks a turning point in the nature of life on Earth. The evolution of eyes is one of the most studied and debated topics in evolutionary biology, and with good reason. The eye, in its most sophisticated forms, is such a complex and precise instrument that it famously prompted skeptics of evolution to ask how such a thing could possibly arise through the gradual, undirected process of natural selection. Charles Darwin himself acknowledged the eye as a challenge to his theory, though he also provided a compelling framework for understanding how it could have evolved through a series of incremental improvements. The fossil record of the ancient oceans provides powerful evidence for the evolutionary pathway that Darwin sketched out in principle. We can see, preserved in rock across hundreds of millions of years, the progression from the simplest possible light-sensitive structures to the complex, high-resolution imaging systems that eventually equipped predators like Anomalocaris and prey like the more advanced trilobites. The starting point, the simplest possible form of light sensitivity, requires nothing more than a patch of cells that are chemically responsive to light. Even the humblest, most primitive eye spot does not need to form an image to provide survival value. Simply detecting the difference between light and dark, or sensing the direction from which light is coming, can be useful information. An organism that can tell when a shadow passes overhead, suggesting the approach of a large predator, has a survival advantage over one that cannot, even if it can form no image of the predator whatsoever. From this beginning, this simplest of sensory capabilities, natural selection can build, step by incremental step, toward greater and greater visual sophistication. Each small improvement in the ability to detect and process light confers some survival advantage, and that advantage drives the selection for further improvements. A shallow cup shape concentrates light from a particular direction, improving directional sensitivity. A deeper cup narrows the field of light further, improving resolution. A transparent covering over the opening protects the sensitive cells and can begin to act as a crude lens. A true lens, focusing light onto an increasingly sophisticated array of light-sensitive cells, transforms the cup into a camera eye. The Cambrian period appears to have been a critical moment in this progression, a time when the development of sophisticated eyes by some predators created powerful selective pressure for defensive responses in their prey, and vice versa. This arms race between visual predators and their prey may itself have been one of the driving forces behind the Cambrian Explosion, the rapid diversification of animal body plans that makes this period so remarkable. This idea, sometimes called the light switch theory of the Cambrian Explosion, was developed by paleontologist Andrew Parker, who argued that the sudden development of good eyesight by predators like Anomalocaris was a triggering event that sent shock waves through the entire ecosystem. When predators can see their prey with high resolution, prey animals face an entirely new and devastating threat. They must respond or die. And their responses: hard shells, defensive spines, camouflage, burrowing behavior, flight responses, and yes, eventually eyes of their own, drove a rapid diversification of forms that shows up in the fossil record as the Cambrian Explosion. Whether this single factor was truly sufficient to explain the entire explosion of Cambrian diversity is debated, and most scientists believe that multiple factors were involved. But the central insight that the development of vision fundamentally transformed the nature of predator-prey interactions and drove evolutionary change across entire ecosystems is well supported by evidence and is widely accepted as an important piece of the Cambrian story. Consider what the world looked like before good vision appeared. Predators and prey interacted primarily through chemical detection, through touch, through the passive sensing of water movements. Hunting was slow, close range, and imprecise. Prey animals had relatively limited options for avoiding predation. They could be unpalatable, they could hide in chemical terms by reducing their scent or taste signature, or they could simply be very small. The ecological relationships were real but constrained. Now introduce an apex predator with high-resolution vision. Suddenly, size is no protection. A large, visible animal may be easier to spot and pursue than a small one. Chemical camouflage becomes irrelevant if the predator can simply see you. Proximity is no longer required to initiate a hunt. An Anomalocaris can spot potential prey from a distance, choose its moment, and launch a pursuit. Every previous defensive strategy is challenged or rendered obsolete. The prey must respond. And the speed with which they respond, the speed at which natural selection can produce significant anatomical changes when the survival pressure is intense enough, is reflected in the fossil record as an explosion of new body forms, new defensive structures, new behavioral strategies. Hard shells appear, spines appear. Eyes appear in prey animals as well, providing the earliest possible warning of an approaching predator. Burrowing becomes common. Getting under the sediment means getting out of the visual field of surface predators. The evolution of vision did not merely give individual predators a better hunting tool. It restructured the entire ecological web of the Cambrian oceans. It changed the rules of survival at every level of the food chain. It was, in this sense, one of the most consequential single evolutionary innovations in the entire history of life, more significant in its immediate ecological impact than almost any other development one could name. And its effects did not stop with the Cambrian period. The visual systems that first evolved in those ancient seas eventually gave rise to every eye in every animal alive today. The compound eyes of Anomalocaris share fundamental structural and biochemical similarities with the compound eyes of modern insects. The camera eyes of vertebrates, including the eyes with which you are reading these words, trace their ancestry to the simple light-sensitive patches of Cambrian organisms. Vision, in all its modern complexity and diversity, began in the warm, crowded, experimentally diverse waters of the ancient Cambrian Sea. As the Cambrian gave way to the Ordovician period, a transition that occurred roughly 485 million years ago, the character of marine life continued to develop and diversify. The great experimental free for all of the Cambrian began to settle into somewhat more established ecological patterns, though the word established should be used cautiously when describing an ocean that still contained no fish with jaws, no large marine reptiles, and no familiar modern body plans to speak of. The Ordovician seas were, by any modern standard, profoundly alien, but they were also, in their own way, spectacularly rich. The trilobites continued to diversify and spread. New groups of animals, the brachiopods, the cephalopods, the echinoderms, expanded dramatically in diversity and abundance. Coral reefs, or structures analogous to modern coral reefs, began to develop, creating complex three-dimensional habitats that supported entirely new ecological communities. And among the most significant of the Ordovician developments was the emergence and diversification of the cephalopods. Word cephalopod means head-foot, a reference to the distinctive anatomy of this group, a group that today includes squid, octopuses, cuttlefish, and nautiluses. The earliest cephalopods were nothing like the nimble, intelligent creatures that modern examples of this group represent. They were encased in long, straight, conical shells, sometimes reaching extraordinary lengths, and they navigated the ancient seas by controlling the buoyancy of gas-filled chambers within their shells. But they were predators. Active, mobile, visually capable predators. And in the Ordovician seas, where the ecological niches left by the decline of some Cambrian apex predators were waiting to be filled, the cephalopods rapidly evolved into some of the largest and most formidable hunters in the marine world. The largest of the Ordovician cephalopods, animals belonging to the group known as the endosaurids, reached lengths that boggle the mind. Some specimens suggest individuals that may have been 9 or 10 meters long, roughly the length of a large school bus. These were not the largest predators that would ever swim in Earth's oceans, but in the Ordovician period, before the evolution of large-jawed fish or marine reptiles, they were without peer. They were the Anomalocaris of their era, the apex predators of an entire world, creatures so large and so capable that they faced no significant threat from other animals. What did these giant cephalopods eat? The evidence suggests they were generalist predators, consuming a wide range of prey including other mollusks, trilobites, and whatever else they could catch. Their large, sophisticated eyes, early cephalopod eyes, were already quite advanced, following an evolutionary pathway that would eventually produce the remarkable camera eyes of modern squid and octopus, gave them excellent visual hunting capabilities. Their tentacles, ringed with suckers or hooks, provided powerful grasping tools, and their beak-like mouths, made of hard, mineralized material, could crack open the shells of armored prey. The Ordovician cephalopods represent another step in the ongoing arms race between predators and prey that the Cambrian Explosion had set in motion. With each new apex predator that evolved, with each new hunting capability that appeared, the defensive responses of prey animals were tested and pushed in new directions. And with each new defensive innovation, thicker shells, more effective burrowing behavior, greater speed in escape, new selective pressures were placed on predators to evolve more powerful hunting capabilities in response. This reciprocal evolutionary pressure, what biologists call coevolution, the process by which two species drive each other's evolution through their ecological interaction, is one of the most powerful forces shaping the history of life. And in the ancient seas of the Paleozoic era, it was operating at full intensity, with consequences that can be read in the rock record across hundreds of millions of years. But before we can follow the story of life forward into the later Paleozoic, we need to address an interruption, a catastrophic interruption, that nearly ended the entire narrative before it had a chance to fully develop. At the end of the Ordovician period, approximately 444 million years ago, the Earth experienced one of the most severe mass extinctions in its history. This event, sometimes called the Late Ordovician Mass Extinction, eliminated roughly 85% of marine species. The diverse, rich ecological communities of the Ordovician seas were devastated. The reef-building communities, the diverse trilobite fauna, the brachiopod communities, the vast array of specialized marine invertebrates, all were swept away or reduced to tiny fractions of their former diversity. What caused this catastrophe? The evidence points to a combination of factors, with glaciation playing a central role. The continental configuration of the Ordovician period had positioned a large landmass over the South Pole, and as this landmass cooled, massive glaciers began to form. The growth of these ice sheets had profound consequences for the global climate and for the world's oceans. Sea levels dropped as water was locked up in ice. Ocean temperatures fell. The circulation patterns of the deep ocean were disrupted. And the chemical composition of the ocean water itself was altered in ways that were fundamentally hostile to many of the organisms living in it. The extinction unfolded in pulses, not as a single sudden event, but as a series of crises separated by intervals of partial recovery. Each pulse eliminated different groups of organisms, attacking different ecological levels and different geographical regions. The cumulative effect was devastating, and yet life survived. Depleted, diminished, reduced to a fraction of its former diversity, but alive. The survivors of the late Ordovician extinction faced a world that had been fundamentally restructured, with ecological niches standing empty and resources left unexploited. And from these survivors, the slow process of ecological rebuilding began. This pattern, catastrophic extinction followed by survival and recovery, will repeat itself throughout our story. It is, in a profound sense, one of the fundamental rhythms of life on Earth. The ancient world was not a place of simple progress and accumulation. It was a place of periodic catastrophe, of mass destruction followed by creative renewal. And understanding this rhythm is essential to understanding how the world we know today came to be. The recovery from the late Ordovician extinction unfolded during the Silurian period, which lasted from approximately 444 to 419 million years ago. The Silurian saw a gradual rebuilding of marine diversity, with some groups recovering more rapidly than others, and new groups rising to fill some of the ecological roles that had been vacated. But the most significant development of the Silurian period for our story is not what happened in the open ocean. It is what began happening in the shallow waters near the margins of the continents and eventually on the land itself. For the first several hundred million years of complex animal life, the land was essentially barren of animals. Plants, or rather plant-like organisms, had begun the colonization of terrestrial environments perhaps 470 million years ago, establishing a thin and patchy cover of green on what had previously been naked rock and soil. But animals had not yet followed. The challenges of life on land, the need to support the body's weight without the buoyancy of water, the need to prevent desiccation, the need to breathe air rather than dissolved oxygen, the need to reproduce without the medium of water, were formidable barriers that life had not yet found ways to overcome. In the Silurian period, some of these barriers began to be breached. The fossil record from this period contains evidence of some of the earliest land animals, creatures that were making the transition from aquatic to terrestrial life, feeling their way into the new environment one tentative step at a time. Among the first animals to successfully colonize the land were the arthropods. This makes sense in retrospect. Arthropods had several features that pre-adapted them for life on land. Their external skeleton, the chitinous exoskeleton that encases their bodies, provided structural support without the need for the internal framework of bones, and it also offered some protection against water loss. Their jointed limbs, evolved originally for locomotion on the seafloor, could be adapted for movement on solid ground, and their compound eyes, already optimized for detecting light, worked perfectly well in air. The earliest land-dwelling arthropods were probably similar to modern centipedes or millipedes, multi-legged, elongated creatures that hugged the ground and fed on the thin layer of organic material available in terrestrial environments. They were not impressive by later standards, small, slow, and restricted to moist environments near water, but they were pioneers. They were among the first animals to breathe air, to walk on dry land, to experience the full, unfiltered intensity of sunlight on open ground. In the Devonian period that followed the Silurian, a period spanning from approximately 419 to 359 million years ago, the colonization of land accelerated dramatically. The Devonian is sometimes called the Age of Fishes, because it was during this period that fish diversity exploded in the marine and freshwater environments of the world. But it was also, critically, the age in which life began its serious push onto dry land. The Devonian oceans introduced another revolution in predator evolution that deserves our attention before we move to the story of terrestrial life. And that revolution had a name: the jaw. The earliest fish, the vertebrates that first appeared in the Cambrian and diversified through the Ordovician and Silurian, were jawless creatures. They fed by filter feeding, or by suction, or by simply pressing their mouths against food items and rasping material off. They were, by any standard, relatively limited in their predatory capabilities. Without jaws, the range of food items accessible to a fish was severely constrained. The evolution of jaws, which appears to have occurred sometime in the early Silurian, with jawed fish becoming increasingly prominent through the Devonian, was one of the most consequential innovations in the history of vertebrate life. A jaw is not merely a tool for biting. It is a transformative piece of anatomy that opens up entirely new ecological possibilities. With a jaw, an animal can seize and manipulate prey items that would otherwise be inaccessible. It can crack open shells. It can dismember large prey. It can grip and tear. It can process food in ways that dramatically increase the range of available food sources. The evolution of jaws in fish effectively created a new category of predator, one that was not only mobile and visually capable, but also physically powerful in ways that no previous marine predator had been. And natural selection, presented with this new toolkit, immediately began producing variations on the jawed fish body plan at a remarkable rate. By the Devonian period, the diversity of jawed fish was extraordinary. Sharks, some of the most evolutionarily conservative animals in the history of vertebrate life, virtually unchanged in their basic body plan across hundreds of millions of years, were already present and beginning to diversify. Ray-finned fish, the group that today accounts for the vast majority of all fish species, were diversifying rapidly. And a group of fish that would eventually prove to be of pivotal importance to our story, the lobe-finned fish, were developing the anatomical features that would one day allow their descendants to walk on land. The Devonian seas also produced what many paleontologists consider to be one of the most terrifying predators in the entire history of life on Earth. The creature's name is Dunkleosteus, and it deserves a place of honor in any account of ancient predators. Dunkleosteus was a placoderm, a member of an entirely extinct class of fish, characterized by a distinctive bony armor covering the head and front portion of the body. The placoderms were a diverse and successful group during the Devonian period, but Dunkleosteus was in a class of its own. It could reach lengths of perhaps 8 to 9 meters, making it one of the largest predators of its age. But raw size was the least remarkable thing about it. Dunkleosteus had no teeth. Instead, its jaws were lined with plates of bone self-sharpening edges that grew continuously, maintaining a razor sharpness through the normal wear of feeding. The bite force of Dunkleosteus has been estimated by researchers using biomechanical models, and the results are extraordinary. The force exerted by the jaws of a large Dunkleosteus may have been among the strongest of any animal that has ever lived, sufficient to punch through the armor of virtually any prey item in the Devonian Ocean, including other heavily armored placoderms. The jaws of Dunkleosteus operated differently from the jaws of most modern predators. Rather than simply closing the lower jaw against the upper, Dunkleosteus used a cranial kinesis, a rotation of the skull itself that simultaneously opened the lower jaw and raised the upper jaw and skull plate. This mechanism created a powerful suction as the mouth opened, drawing prey toward the animal even before the bite itself was delivered. The entire sequence, the sudden expansion of the cranial cavity creating suction, followed by the snap of the jaws, could apparently be completed in a fraction of a second. Dunkleosteus sat at the apex of the Devonian marine food chain. In the oceans it inhabited, virtually nothing was safe from it. Even the early sharks of the Devonian period, already formidable predators in their own right, were likely prey items for large Dunkleosteus individuals. The fossils of Dunkleosteus are sometimes found associated with the regurgitated remains of other animals, partially digested fish that the predator apparently swallowed, and then expelled when the meal proved too large or too difficult to process. Even the digestive system of Dunkleosteus apparently had limits, but the placoderms, including Dunkleosteus, would not survive the next great crisis in Earth's history. At the end of the Devonian period, another mass extinction event struck, eliminating roughly 70% of all species and severely reducing the diversity of marine life. The placoderms, which had been among the dominant fish groups of the Devonian, were completely eliminated. Not a single species survived into the following period. The end Devonian extinction, as it is known, was a complex event, or perhaps more accurately, a complex series of events spanning several million years. The causes are debated, with proposals including widespread ocean anoxia, the depletion of dissolved oxygen from large portions of the ocean, which would have been lethal to most marine animals, climate change, sea level fluctuations, and possibly the effects of the expanding forests on land, which may have altered the chemistry of runoff into the ocean in ways that disrupted marine ecosystems. Whatever the precise mechanisms, the effects were devastating. The rich, diverse, complex marine ecosystems of the Devonian were stripped back dramatically, and once again, the story of life on Earth had to begin rebuilding from the survivors. But as the marine world was being tested and pushed toward catastrophe, something extraordinary was happening at the margins of the ancient seas. In the shallow waters of rivers, lakes, and coastal environments, a revolution was taking shape, one that would ultimately reshape the living world more thoroughly than almost any other event in the history of life. Life was preparing to walk on land. The key players in this transition were the lobe-finned fish, the group of fish characterized by fleshy, muscular fins supported by internal bone structures in arrangements that foreshadow the limb bones of terrestrial vertebrates. In modern terms, the lobe-finned fish are represented by only a handful of surviving species, the lungfish and the coelacanths, but in the Devonian period, they were far more diverse and far more ecologically significant than they are today. The lobe fins were doing something that conventional fish were not. They were using their fins actively and in complex ways to navigate their environment. In the shallow, heavily vegetated, oxygen-poor waters that many lobe-finned fish inhabited, the ability to push against the substrate with stiffened, muscular fins, to essentially do a crude form of walking along the bottom, provided significant advantages. It allowed access to prey in environments where purely swimming fish could not easily follow. It allowed movement between water bodies when the primary pool dried up or became inhospitable. And crucially, many lobe-finned fish were lungfish in the literal sense. They possessed primitive lungs or lung-like structures that allowed them to supplement their gill breathing with atmospheric oxygen. The evolutionary pathway from a lobe-finned fish to a true tetrapod, a four-limbed land animal, unfolded over millions of years, and the fossil record of this transition is now known in remarkable detail. A series of creatures, each one slightly more terrestrially capable than its predecessor, documents the gradual transformation of fins into limbs, of gill breathing into lung breathing, of aquatic life into life capable of surviving on land. Among the most famous of these transitional creatures is Tiktaalik, discovered in the Canadian Arctic and described in 2004. Tiktaalik lived approximately 375 million years ago and possessed a combination of features so perfectly intermediate between fish and tetrapod that it became one of the most celebrated fossil discoveries of the modern era. Tiktaalik had gills like a fish, it had scales like a fish, its body shape was broadly fish-like, but it also had a neck, a feature absent in conventional fish, where the head is fused to the shoulder girdle. It had a flat, wide head, reminiscent of an early amphibian, and most significantly, its fins were supported by an internal structure of bones arranged in a pattern directly ancestral to the arrangement of bones in the arms and hands of tetrapods. Tiktaalik had a fin with a distinct upper arm bone comparable to the humerus, a forearm region comparable to the radius and ulna, and wrist-like bones that could have supported the body's weight. In shallow water or on the banks of streams and pools, Tiktaalik could presumably prop itself up on its stiffened fins and raise its head to look around, surveying its environment with eyes positioned on the top of its flat skull, rather than on the sides of its head as in most fish. This seemingly simple capability, the ability to hold the body above the substrate and turn the head, represents a fundamental shift in the relationship between an animal and its environment. It is the beginning of terrestrial life. The transition from water to land did not happen in a single dramatic leap. It was a gradual process, with the earliest tetrapods spending most of their time in water and making only tentative, limited excursions onto land. The first true tetrapods, animals with 4 distinct limbs, rather than muscular fins, appear in the fossil record at approximately 365 to 375 million years ago, near the end of the Devonian period. Animals like Acanthostega and Ichthyostega, known from fossils discovered in Greenland, represent this earliest phase of tetrapod evolution. They were fully limbed with recognizable digits on their feet. But they were also still profoundly aquatic. Acanthostega in particular had limbs that were not well suited to supporting its body's weight on land. Its limbs appear to have functioned primarily as paddles in water, with terrestrial locomotion being a secondary and probably awkward capability. Even its lungs were apparently supplemented by gills, and it likely spent most or all of its life in water. But it had limbs, it had digits. It had the fundamental anatomical toolkit from which all subsequent tetrapod evolution would proceed. Every amphibian, every reptile, every bird, every mammal, every 4-limbed vertebrate that has ever lived on land is a descendant of creatures that made this transition, that crossed this threshold from aquatic to terrestrial life in the warm shallows of Devonian rivers and coastal wetlands. The Carboniferous period that followed the Devonian, spanning from approximately 359 to 299 million years ago, is one of the most dramatic chapters in the history of terrestrial life. And for reasons that have everything to do with chemistry and atmosphere and the transformation of the physical world. The Carboniferous, its very name derived from the vast coal deposits that characterize rocks of this age, was the Great Age of Forests. Through the Devonian period, land plants had been diversifying steadily, moving from the simplest liverwort like ground huggers to increasingly complex and large forms. By the beginning of the Carboniferous, true forests existed, not the sparse, low-growing plant communities of the earlier periods, but dense, towering forests of tree like lycopsids, horsetails, ferns, and early seed plants, reaching heights comparable to modern forests. These Carboniferous forests were profoundly different from any forest alive today. The trees that dominated them, the giant lycopsids like Lepidodendron and Sigillaria, were not closely related to any modern tree. They grew as hollow cylinders of bark, reaching heights of 30 or 40 meters, with most of their photosynthetic activity occurring in the upper portions of the plant near the canopy. The forests they created were dark, humid, and ecologically complex, providing a three-dimensional habitat that land animals could exploit in entirely new ways, and animals were exploiting it. The Carboniferous was, in terrestrial terms, a time of rapid evolutionary diversification comparable in spirit, though not in raw scale, to the Cambrian Explosion in the oceans. The early tetrapods were diversifying into a growing range of ecological niches. Insects, which had first appeared on land during the Devonian, were diversifying explosively and eventually achieving body sizes never seen before or since, dragonfly-like creatures with wingspans of more than half a meter, millipede-like animals stretching to nearly 2 meters in length. Why could insects grow so large in the Carboniferous? The answer lies in the atmosphere. The photosynthetic activity of the vast Carboniferous forests, pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and releasing oxygen, drove atmospheric oxygen levels to their highest point in Earth's history, reaching concentrations perhaps 50% higher than modern levels. For insects which breathe through a system of tubes running directly through their bodies rather than through dedicated lungs or gills, higher atmospheric oxygen means the diffusion of oxygen throughout the body can sustain larger body sizes. In the oxygen-rich atmosphere of the Carboniferous, insects could grow to dimensions impossible in modern air. The Carboniferous forests were also the setting for an evolutionary development of enormous long-term significance, the amniotic egg. The early amphibians, the descendants of the Devonian tetrapods, were tied to water for reproduction. Like modern frogs and salamanders, they laid eggs that needed to remain moist, and their larvae were aquatic creatures that breathed with gills before metamorphosing into their adult form. This dependence on water for reproduction limited the range of environments that early tetrapods could colonize. They could live away from water as adults, but they had to return to water to breed. The amniotic egg, an egg with a series of protective membranes and a shell that prevents desiccation, broke this constraint. An amniotic egg contains its own supply of water, enclosed in a membranous sac. The embryo develops within this self-contained aquatic environment, protected from desiccation by the outer shell. The animal can be laid anywhere on dry land, far from any body of water, and the embryo inside is perfectly maintained. The first animals to evolve the amniotic egg were the amniotes, the group that eventually gave rise to all modern reptiles, birds, and mammals. The exact timing of this evolution is difficult to pin down from fossils alone, since eggs rarely fossilize, and the distinction between amphibian-grade and amniote-grade animals is not always easy to read in the skeletons of the earliest examples. But by the mid-Carboniferous, the amniotes were clearly present, and they were diversifying into the environments of the ancient forests with increasing success. The evolution of the amniotic egg was not merely a reproductive convenience. It was a key that unlocked the entire terrestrial world. An egg that could be laid anywhere, amniote animals were free to colonize environments far from water, the dry uplands, the interior of continents, the harsh and variable environments that had previously been inaccessible. And they did exactly that, diversifying into a range of ecological roles that the water-dependent amphibians could never fully exploit. Among the early amniotes, a fundamental split occurred, a split whose consequences for the history of life cannot be overstated. On one branch of this split were the animals that would eventually give rise to reptiles and birds. On the other branch were the synapsids, the group from which mammals and ultimately human beings would descend. This split occurred very early in amniote evolution, certainly by the late Carboniferous and possibly earlier. And from the very beginning, the synapsid lineage showed characteristics that would distinguish it from the reptile line. A different arrangement of skull bones, different jaw muscles, a different approach to the fundamental business of being a land animal. For much of the Carboniferous and into the subsequent Permian period, the synapsids were the dominant large land animals on Earth. They filled ecological niches from herbivore to apex predator. they diversified into dozens of families and hundreds of species, and they shaped the terrestrial ecosystems of the late Paleozoic in ways that left indelible marks on the fossil record. As the Carboniferous gave way to the Permian period, beginning approximately 299 million years ago, the great Carboniferous coal forests were declining. The climate was becoming drier. The vast tropical forests that had covered much of the equatorial landmass were fragmenting and retreating, replaced by more arid conditions across large portions of the world. And this environmental change was simultaneously a challenge and an opportunity, challenging for the organisms adapted to the humid forest environment and an opportunity for those capable of exploiting the new, drier conditions. The synapsids, the mammal-line amniotes, rose to this challenge magnificently. Through the early and middle Permian, they diversified rapidly and dominated terrestrial ecosystems in ways that would not be seen again until the Cenozoic era, the age of mammals following the extinction of the dinosaurs. Among the most spectacular of these early synapsid successes was a creature that has become something of an icon of the ancient world, the sail-backed Dimetrodon. Dimetrodon is often mistakenly referred to as a dinosaur, and it appears in dinosaur-themed toys and books with a frequency that would infuriate any paleontologist. Dimetrodon was emphatically not a dinosaur. It predated the dinosaurs by more than 40 million years, and more significantly, it was not even a reptile in the evolutionary sense. Dimetrodon was a synapsid, a member of the lineage that would eventually produce mammals. It was more closely related to you than it was to any lizard, crocodile, or dinosaur. The most visually striking feature of Dimetrodon, the feature that makes it instantly recognizable even to non-specialists, was the tall, elaborate sail formed by enormously elongated neural spines extending from its backbone. In the largest Dimetrodon individuals, these spines could be a meter or more in height, supporting a broad sail of skin that stretched along much of the animal's length. What was this sail for? The question has generated considerable scientific debate, and the answer may be more nuanced than the most popular explanations suggest. The traditional interpretation, and still a reasonable one, though perhaps not the complete picture, is that the sail functioned as a thermoregulatory device. Dimetrodon, like all early amniotes, was likely ectothermic, dependent on external heat sources to regulate its body temperature. By orienting the sail toward the sun, an individual could absorb solar radiation rapidly, warming its body to an active temperature far more quickly than a sail-less animal of the same body size. Conversely, by orienting away from the sun or positioning itself in shade, the sail could help dissipate heat when the animal was too warm. This thermoregulatory advantage would have been significant in the ecological competition of the early Permian. An animal that can reach its active body temperature quickly in the morning, before competitors whose bodies are still cold and sluggish, has a meaningful head start on the day's hunting. And in an ecosystem where multiple synapsid species were competing for similar prey, even a modest advantage in morning activity time could translate into meaningful differences in hunting success and survival. More recent research has proposed additional functions for the sail or alternative functions entirely. Some researchers have suggested that the sail may have played a role in display, that the large, visually prominent structure was used in intraspecific communication, helping individuals recognize members of their own species, assess the fitness of potential mates, or signal dominance in territorial disputes. These functions are not mutually exclusive with thermoregulation, and it is entirely possible that the sail served multiple purposes simultaneously. Dimetrodon was a predator, an apex predator in the ecosystems it inhabited. Its jaws were equipped with teeth of different sizes and shapes, a condition called heterodonty, having differentiated teeth, that is characteristic of the synapsid lineage, and would eventually, in mammals, develop into the highly specialized dental arrangements of carnivores, herbivores, and omnivores. In Dimetrodon, this differentiation was beginning to emerge. Large, shearing teeth at the front for seizing and killing prey, and different teeth further back for processing it. It hunted a variety of prey, including other synapsids, early reptiles, and the large, salamander-like amphibians that were still common in the environments of the early Permian. It was itself presumably under threat from little more than competitors of its own kind. Large Dimetrodon was very likely at or near the top of the food chain in its ecological community, and Dimetrodon was not alone. The Permian terrestrial ecosystems teemed with a diversity of synapsid animals, some large and predatory like Dimetrodon itself, others herbivorous or omnivorous, occupying the lower levels of the food chain and sustaining the predators above them. There were the heavy-bodied, barrel-chested herbivores like Edaphosaurus, another sail-backed synapsid, though its sail was structured slightly differently from that of Dimetrodon, and the smaller, more agile species that darted through the vegetation of the Permian world. Through the Middle Permian, the synapsids continued to evolve in directions that increasingly foreshadow the mammals of the later Mesozoic and Cenozoic. The group known as the therapsids, the direct ancestors of mammals, developed more upright postures than their sprawling predecessors, with limbs positioned more directly beneath the body rather than extending to the sides. They showed evidence of increasingly active metabolisms, with some species possibly developing the beginnings of endothermy, the ability to generate body heat internally rather than depending on external sources. The therapsids were diverse, successful, and apparently well on their way to dominating the terrestrial world when the future was interrupted. When the trajectory of life on land was suddenly and catastrophically bent in an entirely new direction by an event so severe, so all-encompassing, so destructive in its impact on the living world, that scientists reaching for language adequate to describe it have sometimes simply called it the Great Dying. Before we reach that catastrophe, let us pause for a moment and consider what the world looked like at the peak of the late Permian, roughly 252 million years ago, in the moments before everything changed. The continents had come together into a single vast landmass, a supercontinent that geologists call Pangaea. Almost all of the Earth's land was joined in one enormous continuous area, stretching from pole to pole, surrounded by a single immense ocean. The interior of Pangaea was vast and dry, a continental interior far from any moderating oceanic influence, subject to temperature extremes that would challenge any modern organism. The coasts were more hospitable, warmed by the surrounding ocean and relatively well watered by rain systems driven by the moisture evaporating from the great ocean. In these coastal and mid-latitude environments, the therapsids were extraordinarily diverse and successful. The herbivorous dicynodonts, stocky, often large animals with a pair of tusk-like teeth and a horny beak, convergently similar in many ways to modern tortoises or hippopotamuses in their ecological role, were abundant and species-rich. The carnivorous gorgonopsians, with large saber-like canine teeth, relatively advanced locomotor capabilities, and metabolisms that may have been partially endothermic, were the apex predators, hunting the dicynodonts and other herbivores. In the oceans, meanwhile, the marine fauna of the late Permian was dominated by groups that had diversified through the Carboniferous and early Permian, brachiopods, crinoids, bryozoans, and various other invertebrate groups that built and maintained complex ecological communities, including reef structures. The seas teemed with life, organized into food chains and ecological communities of considerable sophistication. And then the world ended. Not literally, life survived. But in the scale of its destruction, in the depth of the ecological devastation it caused, the end Permian mass extinction deserves to be considered the closest approach to a complete biological reset that has occurred in the 500 million years or so of complex animal life on Earth. The trigger for this catastrophe was geological. In what is now Siberia, one of the largest volcanic events in the history of the planet began to unfold, a massive outpouring of lava from fissures in the Earth's crust that would eventually cover an area of approximately 2 million square kilometers with volcanic rock to depths of several kilometers. This event, known as the Siberian Traps volcanic eruption, continued for perhaps a million years, releasing enormous quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other gases into the atmosphere. The consequences were cascading and mutually reinforcing. The carbon dioxide released by the volcanic activity caused rapid and severe global warming, far more dramatic than the gradual warming of more recent geological history. This warming had multiple downstream effects. It disrupted the circulation patterns of the oceans, reducing the mixing of surface and deep waters and leading to widespread ocean anoxia, the depletion of dissolved oxygen from vast stretches of the deep ocean. It acidified the ocean water as carbon dioxide dissolved into it, creating conditions hostile to the calcium carbonate shells and skeletons of marine invertebrates. It disrupted rainfall patterns across the continents, turning previously productive environments into uninhabitable deserts. The sulfur dioxide released by the volcanic eruptions had additional effects, causing acid rain that fell across the continents and into the oceans, further stressing terrestrial and marine ecosystems. And the eruptions themselves may have caused additional complications through the burning of large coal deposits in the Siberian crust, releasing additional carbon dioxide and potentially toxic organic compounds into the environment. In the marine realm, the effects were catastrophic beyond imagining. Over 90% of marine species were eliminated. The complex reef communities that had taken hundreds of millions of years to build were destroyed. The brachiopods, which had been among the most diverse and abundant animals in the sea for hundreds of millions of years, were reduced from hundreds of species to a handful. The crinoids, the bryozoans, the foraminifera, the corals, entire ecosystems of organisms, communities of almost unimaginable richness and complexity, were swept away, and this loss was not merely a temporary setback. The ecological structures that had supported these communities, the physical habitat provided by reefs, the food chains built on filter feeders and plankton, collapsed along with the organisms themselves. The oceans that survived the end Permian extinction were not merely depleted versions of the Permian oceans. They were fundamentally different systems, simplified to a degree that the modern mind struggles to grasp. For millions of years after the extinction, the marine world was dominated by opportunistic, stress-tolerant organisms, the ecological equivalents of weeds, while the complex, specialized communities of the Permian lay in ruins. On land, the situation was hardly better. The diverse therapsid fauna of the late Permian was decimated. The gorgonopsians, those saber-toothed apex predators of the Permian world, were entirely eliminated. The vast majority of dicynodont species were wiped out. The complex terrestrial ecosystems of the late Permian, built up over millions of years of ecological development, collapsed as thoroughly and as completely as the marine ecosystems. The precise death toll among terrestrial species is harder to calculate from the fossil record than the marine toll, because terrestrial preservation is generally poorer. But conservative estimates suggest that perhaps 70% of land vertebrate species were eliminated, with some analyses suggesting even higher percentages. Insects, which had sailed through the late Ordovician and end Devonian extinctions with relatively little damage, were significantly affected by the end Permian event, in what represents the only mass extinction known to have substantially reduced insect diversity. The world that emerged from the end Permian catastrophe was not merely impoverished. It was, in many ways, a blank slate. The ecological architecture of the Permian had been removed. The niches that predators and prey had spent hundreds of millions of years filling were empty. The food chains that had organized the flow of energy through terrestrial and marine ecosystems had been severed. Life would have to begin again, not from zero, but from a much simpler foundation than the one that had existed before. And this, in many ways, is where the most important part of our story begins. Not in the spectacular predators and strange experiments of the Cambrian, not in the ancient arms races of the Devonian, not even in the great Permian ecosystems that the catastrophe destroyed. The most important part of our story is what happened next. How life responded to the greatest crisis it had ever faced. How it rebuilt, slowly and stubbornly, from the ruins of a world that had nearly ceased to exist. Because in that rebuilding, in that slow, grinding, millions of years long process of ecological recovery, lay the seeds of everything that would follow. The seeds of the age of dinosaurs that was about to begin. The seeds of the mammals that would eventually inherit the earth. And ultimately, across the immensity of geological time, the seeds of the living world that surrounds us today. The ancient oceans, the strange creatures of the Cambrian Explosion, the first predators and the first eyes, the long crawl onto land, and the catastrophe that nearly erased it all, these are not simply stories of the distant past. They are the foundation upon which everything we know is built. They are the first chapters of a story that continues to this day in every living organism on Earth, carrying within its cells the biochemical legacy of 500 million years of survival and adaptation and loss and renewal. This is where we have come from. This is the ancient world that built us. And in the second part of our journey, we will follow the aftermath of catastrophe, the slow return of life, the new ecosystems rising from the ashes of the old, the creatures that would come to dominate the world after the Great Dying, and the long, extraordinary road that led from the ruins of the Permian to the world as it exists today. The story is far from over. In many ways, the most astonishing chapters are still to come. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, please check out Part 1 to start this incredible journey from the very beginning. And if you have not already, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss a future video. We left our story at the edge of an abyss. The world of the late Permian, that rich, complex, extraordinarily diverse biological tapestry that had been woven together over hundreds of millions of years, had been torn apart. Not slowly, not gradually, but with a geological suddenness that left the living world reeling. The oceans were graveyards, the land was a wasteland. The food chains that had organized life's energy for millions of years lay in ruins, their components gone, their structure collapsed, their future uncertain. More than 90% of marine species had vanished. More than 2/3 of terrestrial vertebrate species had been eliminated. Entire ecological communities, reef systems that had taken hundreds of millions of years to construct, forest ecosystems that had sheltered and sustained extraordinary diversity for geological ages, had simply ceased to exist. The world that emerged from the end Permian catastrophe was not the world that had preceded it. It was something simpler, harsher, more austere, more desperate. It was a world stripped nearly to its biological bones, and yet life survived. Not much of it relative to what had existed before, not in the rich, organized, ecologically complex form it had previously achieved, but life stubborn, adaptive, resourceful, fundamentally unkillable in any absolute sense, clung to existence in the places where conditions remained marginally tolerable, and from those refuges it began to do what life always does when given the slimmest opportunity. It began to grow. It began to diversify. It began, with painful slowness measured in millions of years, to rebuild. This is the story of that rebuilding, and it is, in its own way, one of the most remarkable stories in the entire history of our planet. To understand the recovery from the end Permian extinction, we must first understand something about the nature of ecological recovery itself, about how biological communities rebuild after catastrophic destruction, and about the factors that determine which organisms survive such events and which do not. Mass extinctions are not random events in their biological effects. They do not eliminate organisms at random, picking species from the full diversity of life with no regard to their characteristics. They select the specific nature of the environmental crisis, the particular combination of stresses that the extinction event imposes, tends to eliminate organisms with certain characteristics while sparing those with others. And the survivors, by definition, possess whatever combination of traits allowed them to endure conditions that proved lethal to the vast majority of their contemporaries. In the case of the end Permian extinction, the suite of environmental stresses was broad and severe. Extreme heat, ocean acidification, widespread anoxia in the deep ocean, disrupted rainfall patterns on land, collapse of food chains at multiple levels. To survive, this combination of conditions required a particular kind of biological flexibility, the ability to tolerate a wide range of environmental conditions, to exploit whatever food sources remained available, to reproduce successfully even in degraded environments. The organisms that possessed these qualities, the generalists, the opportunists, the stress-tolerant, were the ones that made it through. The highly specialized species, those that had evolved exquisitely refined adaptations to specific environments or specific food sources that no longer existed, were eliminated with terrible efficiency. The ancient principle of ecology held true even in the face of global catastrophe. Specialization is a luxury that works magnificently when conditions are stable, but becomes a lethal liability when the ground shifts beneath your feet. On land, this principle is reflected clearly in the pattern of vertebrate survivors. Among the synapsids, the dicynodonts, those broad-beaked, relatively generalist herbivores that could presumably process a wide range of plant material, survived the extinction, though in greatly reduced diversity. One group in particular, a lineage represented by animals related to the genus Lystrosaurus, came through the disaster so successfully relative to its competitors that in the immediate aftermath of the extinction, Lystrosaurus-like animals may have constituted the majority of large land vertebrate individuals on Earth. This is a remarkable situation, a single genus dominating global terrestrial vertebrate communities in a way that has no parallel in the complex ecological world of the preceding Permian. Lystrosaurus has sometimes been called the most successful land animal in the history of life, based on this brief but extraordinary dominance of terrestrial ecosystems. Whether this characterization is quite accurate is debatable. Success in biology is difficult to define and measure, but the point it reflects is valid. In the immediate aftermath of the greatest mass extinction in Earth's history, one animal group was so comparatively resilient, so capable of surviving on whatever resources remained, that it came to dominate the impoverished world left behind. What made Lystrosaurus so resilient? Several factors probably contributed. It was a medium-sized animal, small enough not to require enormous food resources, but large enough to be physically robust. Its toothless, beak-like mouth could process a wide range of plant material, including the tough, low-quality vegetation that was likely all that remained in many environments. It may have had some capacity for burrowing, for getting underground and avoiding the worst of the surface temperature extremes. And it was apparently capable of reproducing rapidly and at relatively young ages, which is always an advantage when population sizes have been catastrophically reduced. Lystrosaurus was not a sophisticated animal. It was not, by any standard, among the most elegant or impressive creatures of the Permian world. But in a world where elegance and sophistication had just proven fatal to those who possessed them, simplicity and flexibility were precisely what the moment required. The recovery of terrestrial ecosystems following the end Permian extinction was a gradual process that unfolded over millions of years, and its progress was far from linear. There were setbacks, secondary crises, periods when recovery seemed to stall or reverse. The early Triassic period, the geological age immediately following the Permian, was, for much of its duration, a world still in ecological crisis, struggling to rebuild complex biological communities from a greatly impoverished starting point. The evidence for this prolonged crisis is written clearly in the rock record. For millions of years after the extinction event itself, the fossil record shows an ecological world of unusual simplicity, low diversity, dominated by opportunistic species, lacking the complex, multi-tiered community structures of the pre-extinction world. Recovery, when it came, happened unevenly. Some groups rebounded relatively quickly, while others were effectively finished as significant ecological players. The reef-building communities of the marine realm, for example, took approximately 10 million years to begin reconstructing anything comparable to the complex reef ecosystems of the Permian. For 10 million years, the oceans were largely reef-free, a condition profoundly different from anything that had existed for hundreds of millions of years before, but recovery did come. Slowly, haltingly, with setbacks and reversals, but inexorably. And as it progressed, it produced new ecological configurations, new arrangements of species and communities that differed from the Permian world in significant ways. The organisms that rebuilt the living world after the Great Dying were not simply rebuilt versions of the organisms that had been destroyed. They were different animals with different capabilities, different ecological strategies, different evolutionary trajectories. The world they built was genuinely new. Among the most significant of the early Triassic recoveries, in terms of long-term consequences for the history of life, was the emergence and rapid diversification of the archosaurs. The archosaurs, a group whose name translates roughly as ruling lizards, though they are not particularly closely related to modern lizards, were a lineage of reptiles that appeared and began diversifying in the early to middle Triassic period, in the ecological vacuum created by the end Permian extinction. They were not the only organisms diversifying in this period, but they would prove to be the most consequential, because the archosaurs were the ancestors of two of the most significant vertebrate groups in the history of life, the crocodilians, which survived to the present day, and the dinosaurs, and through the dinosaurs, the birds. The early archosaurs were not yet the massive, spectacular animals that dinosaurs would eventually become. They were medium-sized to large reptiles, occupying a range of ecological roles from predator to herbivore, and they competed with surviving synapsids and other reptile groups for dominance in the recovering Triassic world. For much of the early and middle Triassic, the outcome of this competition was far from certain. The synapsids, the mammal-line animals that had dominated the Permian, were still present in considerable diversity and were not obviously losing ground to their archosaur competitors. But through the middle Triassic, the balance began to shift. The archosaurs were increasingly diverse and increasingly successful. Among their number were animals that showed significant improvements in locomotion, a more upright posture, with limbs positioned more directly beneath the body rather than extending to the sides. This anatomical change is more significant than it might initially appear. An upright posture with limbs directly supporting the body's weight beneath the center of gravity allows for more energy-efficient locomotion, higher sustained speeds, and greater endurance than the more sprawling posture characteristic of many early reptiles. These locomotor advantages were part of the archosaurs' growing success. And they would eventually be refined in the dinosaur lineage to produce the fully erect bipedal posture that is one of the most immediately recognizable characteristics of many famous dinosaur species. But that development lay still in the future, in the middle and late Triassic period. Before the age of dinosaurs could fully arrive, the Triassic world had to navigate another significant challenge, a challenge that, while far less severe than the end Permian catastrophe, was nevertheless powerful enough to reshuffle the ecological deck and open new opportunities for the groups that would define the Mesozoic era. The end Triassic mass extinction, occurring approximately 201 million years ago, was triggered by another massive volcanic event, this one associated with the opening of the Atlantic Ocean as the supercontinent Pangaea began to break apart. The volcanic activity released enormous quantities of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, causing rapid warming and ocean acidification similar in nature, though less extreme in scale, to the processes that had driven the end Permian catastrophe. The end Triassic extinction eliminated a significant fraction of marine and terrestrial species, perhaps 70 to 80% of all species, depending on how one counts. Among the most significantly affected groups were the large, crocodile-like archosaurs that had been among the dominant predators of the Triassic world and various groups of non-dinosaurian reptiles that had diversified in the Triassic. Many of the large synapsid lineages that had persisted from the Permian were further reduced or eliminated. And when the dust settled, when the volcanic crisis eased and conditions on the planet stabilized, the ecological landscape of the world had changed profoundly. The dinosaurs, which had been one archosaur group among many in the Triassic, now found themselves in a world where many of their competitors had been eliminated, and the ecological niches they occupied were suddenly open to exploitation. They radiated into these empty niches with extraordinary speed and diversity, and in doing so they launched the age that now bears their name. But here is the crucial point for our story. None of this, not the dinosaurs, not the birds, not the complex ecological world of the Mesozoic era, would have been possible without everything that came before. The Cambrian Explosion gave life the body plans from which all subsequent animal diversity would develop. The evolution of vision in the ancient seas transformed predator-prey relationships and drove the diversification of animal forms. The transition to land opened an entirely new realm for vertebrate life, the development of the amniotic egg-freed land animals from dependence on water for reproduction. The therapsids and their Permian relatives developed the anatomical and physiological innovations that would eventually produce the mammals. And the Great Dying, as devastating as it was, as thorough in its destruction, cleared the ecological stage for the new actors of the Mesozoic to take their places. The ancient world before the dinosaurs was not a prelude, it was a foundation. It was the long, complex, extraordinarily eventful process by which the living world was first built, tested, destroyed, and rebuilt in preparation for the chapters that followed. Now let us return to the creatures of the ancient seas and lands that we have not yet fully explored, because the story of life before the dinosaurs is richer and stranger than any summary can fully capture, and there are still remarkable animals waiting to be introduced. Let us go back for a moment to the Carboniferous period, that age of vast forests and oxygen-rich air that we touched upon in Part 1. Because the Carboniferous was not merely the age of giant insects and early amniotes. It was also the age of the first great terrestrial predators, animals that hunted on land with an effectiveness and sophistication that had no precedent in the brief history of terrestrial life. Among these early predators, one group stands out for the combination of size, predatory capability, and ecological impact: the temnospondyls. The temnospondyls were amphibians, or more precisely, they were a diverse group of early tetrapods that, like modern amphibians, were dependent on water or moist environments for reproduction. But unlike the small, cautious amphibians that typically come to mind, the temnospondyls could reach sizes that are genuinely startling. Some species achieved lengths of more than 5 meters, comparable to a large modern crocodile, with broad, flat heads bearing enormous mouths lined with numerous sharp teeth. These animals were not graceful. Their sprawling posture and relatively short limbs limited their speed on land, and they were probably most effective as ambush predators, lying motionless in or near water until prey came within range, then lunging with sudden, explosive speed to seize whatever was unfortunate enough to come too close. This strategy, patience, stillness, and sudden, devastating precision, is one that evolution has reinvented many times across the history of vertebrate life because it is extraordinarily effective when executed well. The temnospondyls were a remarkably persistent group. They had first appeared in the Carboniferous, survived the end Permian extinction with significant losses but in reduced form, and continued into the Mesozoic era, persisting well into the age of dinosaurs before finally fading from the fossil record. In terms of geological longevity, they were extraordinarily successful, surviving and adapting through multiple major extinction events and hundreds of millions of years of environmental change. What made the temnospondyls so durable? Part of the answer lies precisely in the amphibious lifestyle that in other ways constrained them. By maintaining their dependence on aquatic or semi-aquatic environments, temnospondyls could exploit a resource base, the water itself and the organisms living in and around it, that remained relatively stable even when terrestrial conditions were disrupted. They were, in a sense, hedging their ecological bets by remaining tied to two environments rather than committing fully to one. The largest of the temnospondyls, animals like Mastodonsaurus, Prionosuchus, and Metaposaurus, were formidable predators in the environments they inhabited. Metaposaurus, for example, has left fossil evidence suggesting populations of large numbers of individuals, possibly gathering at water sources during dry seasons in a manner reminiscent of modern hippo communities. These aggregations of large, toothy amphibians would have been significant features of the ecosystems they inhabited, consuming large quantities of fish and other aquatic prey, cycling nutrients through their bodies, and shaping the ecology of their environments through their sheer physical presence. But the temnospondyls were not alone in exploiting the predatory opportunities of the late Paleozoic and early Mesozoic world. Alongside them, and in some environments and periods, supplanting them as dominant predators, were the archosaurs that we have already briefly introduced, and the diverse group of early reptiles that filled a remarkable range of ecological roles during the Triassic period. The Triassic period, spanning from approximately 252 to 201 million years ago, was one of the most ecologically dynamic intervals in the history of vertebrate life. With the slate of the late Permian world wiped nearly clean, and with a diverse array of surviving groups competing to fill the empty ecological space, the Triassic was a time of intense evolutionary experimentation that recalls, in spirit, the Cambrian Explosion of 500 million years earlier. The seas of the Triassic provide some of the most spectacular examples of this rapid adaptive radiation. As the marine ecosystems slowly recovered from the end Permian catastrophe, the ecological niches left vacant by the extinction were available to any group capable of filling them. And the groups that stepped into these niches were, in many cases, groups making their first significant incursion into the marine environment, terrestrial or semi-aquatic animals whose ancestors had never made their living in the open ocean. Among the most dramatic of these marine invasions was the emergence of the first large marine reptiles. Vertebrates had first conquered the sea, or more precisely, had first evolved in the sea in the Cambrian and Ordovician periods in the form of the earliest fish. But through the late Paleozoic, the dominant large predators of the marine world had been fish, various groups of sharks, bony fishes, and their relatives. Reptiles which had evolved on land had not yet made significant inroads into the open ocean. In the Triassic period, this began to change. Several independent lineages of terrestrial reptiles made the transition back to aquatic or marine life, a process called secondary aquatic adaptation, and in doing so, opened up entirely new possibilities for vertebrate life in the sea. The first of these marine reptile lineages to achieve prominence were the ichthyosaurs, animals whose name means fish lizards, though they were neither fish nor, in the strict evolutionary sense, lizards. The ichthyosaurs evolved from terrestrial reptilian ancestors sometime in the early Triassic, and they adapted to marine life with remarkable speed and thoroughness. By the Middle Triassic, they had already developed the streamlined, fish-like body form that would characterize the group for the rest of its 200-million-year existence. The body form of ichthyosaurs is a stunning example of convergent evolution, the phenomenon by which different evolutionary lineages, facing similar ecological challenges, independently arrive at similar solutions. The sleek torpedo-shaped body of an ichthyosaur is remarkably similar to that of a modern dolphin or tuna, animals that are not closely related to ichthyosaurs, but that face the same fundamental physical challenge of moving efficiently through water. The laws of hydrodynamics constrain the range of effective body shapes for fast aquatic locomotion, and natural selection, operating independently in ichthyosaurs and in dolphins millions of years apart, converged on the same solution. The largest ichthyosaurs were enormous, Some of the Triassic forms, animals like Shawnosaurus, known from fossils in what is now Nevada, may have reached lengths of 15 meters or more, making them among the largest animals of their era. These were not lumbering, slow creatures. The streamlined body, the powerful tail fin, the large eyes, a feature that ichthyosaurs developed to an extraordinary degree, with some species having the largest eyes of any vertebrate ever, all suggest animals capable of fast, sustained swimming and deep, dark water hunting. The eyes of ichthyosaurs deserve particular attention because they connect our story back to the theme of vision and its evolutionary significance that we explored in Part 1. The largest known ichthyosaur eyes, belonging to a species called Temnodontosaurus, had a diameter of approximately 20 centimeters, making them the largest eyes of any known vertebrate. By comparison, a modern blue whale, which may be the largest animal that has ever lived, has eyes only about 15 centimeters in diameter. Why such large eyes? The most compelling explanation is depth. Eyes become larger when an organism needs to see in low light conditions, when it needs to gather enough photons to form useful images in environments where light is scarce. Modern deep-diving animals like the colossal squid also have enormous eyes for exactly this reason. The large eyes of ichthyosaurs suggest that these animals were diving to considerable depths in their hunting, pursuing prey in the darkness of the deep ocean, where only an extraordinarily light-gathering eye could function effectively. This inference is supported by other lines of evidence. The bones around ichthyosaur eyes, a ring of small bones called sclerotic rings that supported the large, soft eyeball, are often preserved in fossils, and their structure can tell us something about the shape and focusing capabilities of the eye. Analysis of these structures in ichthyosaurs suggests eyes adapted for both low light conditions and the optical distortions that underwater vision produces. These were not general-purpose eyes. They were precision instruments, fine-tuned by natural selection for a very specific hunting environment. The ichthyosaurs represent one of the great success stories of the Mesozoic marine world. They persisted for approximately 160 million years, from the early Triassic well into the Cretaceous period, and during that time they occupied the apex predator role in many marine ecosystems. They were, in a very real sense, the dolphins and killer whales of the ancient seas, fast, intelligent, or at least neurologically sophisticated, visually capable, and occupying a position in the food chain that few other animals could challenge. But the ichthyosaurs were not alone in conquering the Mesozoic seas. Alongside them, and in some ecological contexts, competing directly with them, were the plesiosaurs, another group of secondarily aquatic reptiles that took a fundamentally different approach to the engineering challenge of marine locomotion. Where ichthyosaurs were streamlined and fish-like, plesiosaurs were something altogether different. Their bodies were broad and relatively inflexible, their tails short and unlikely to have provided the primary propulsion that the tail provides in ichthyosaurs and fish. Instead, plesiosaurs moved through the water using 4 large, powerful flippers, a locomotion style that has been compared, somewhat imperfectly, to underwater flight, in that the flippers provided thrust by moving through the water in a manner analogous to the way a bird's wings move through air. This distinction in locomotion style is not merely a technical curiosity. It reflects fundamentally different ecological strategies and hunting approaches. The streamlined ichthyosaur, built for speed and maneuverability, was adapted for pursuit hunting, chasing down fast-moving prey in open water. The plesiosaur, with its different locomotor system and very different body proportions, may have been better suited to a different hunting mode, potentially ambush hunting, or hunting in different water column positions. The plesiosaurs themselves were divided into 2 very different body plan variations that dominated marine ecosystems across much of the Mesozoic. The long-necked plesiosaurs, the plesiosauroids, had relatively small heads on extraordinarily long, flexible necks, with compact bodies and robust flippers. The short-necked forms, the plesiosaurids, had massive heads on short, powerful necks, with streamlined bodies built for speed and powered by enormous, paddle-like flippers. The pliosaurs, the short-necked, large-headed forms, were among the most formidable predators that have ever lived in the oceans of Earth. Animals like Plesiosaurus and Chronosaurus had skulls of staggering size. The skull of a large Plesiosaurus could reach nearly 3 meters in length, and jaws equipped with massive, conical teeth designed for seizing and puncturing large prey. These animals were not filter feeders or small prey specialists. They were apex predators of the first order, capable of tackling virtually any animal in the Mesozoic seas. The bite force of large pliosaurs has been estimated to have been among the most powerful of any animal known to science. The jaw muscles, working through a skull architecture specifically optimized for force transmission, could generate enough pressure to crush through bone and thick hide with relative ease. In the Jurassic and Cretaceous oceans where these animals lived and hunted, even the large ichthyosaurs of the time were potential prey items. The long-necked plesiosauroids, meanwhile, pursued a very different strategy. Their small heads and numerous, interlocking teeth suggest adaptation for catching fish and other small, fast-moving prey. The long neck, in some species reaching lengths greater than the body itself, may have allowed the animal to approach schools of fish from below without the bulk of its body, creating the water disturbances that would alert and scatter prey. By extending the small, low-disturbance head toward the fish on a long, flexible neck, the animal could potentially reach the prey before its presence was detected. The long-necked plesiosaurs have also inspired one of the most persistent and widespread legends in popular culture, the idea of a surviving plesiosaur in deep lakes, most famously in the form of the Loch Ness Monster. This idea is scientifically untenable for multiple reasons. Plesiosaurs are known to be entirely extinct, and no modern lake could support an apex predator of their size. But it is a testament to the enduring power of these animals in human imagination, even filtered through the distorting lens of popular mythology. As the Triassic gave way to the Jurassic and then the Cretaceous, the story of life in the seas continued to develop in directions that maintain the fundamental themes of competition, predation, and ecological complexity that had characterized marine life since the Cambrian. New groups rose to prominence. Some older groups declined or disappeared. The choreography of ecological relationships shifted and evolved as conditions changed. But on land, through this same interval, a different drama was unfolding, one that is in many ways the most famous story in paleontology, and that forms the backdrop against which all the evolutionary achievements of the preceding hundreds of millions of years must ultimately be understood. On land, the dinosaurs were inheriting the Earth. We should be precise about what this means, because popular culture has often given us a misleading picture of what the age of dinosaurs was actually like. It was not a world ruled by a handful of familiar species, not simply a world of Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops and Brachiosaurus, the iconic animals whose images dominate museum exhibitions and children's books. The age of dinosaurs, spanning from the late Triassic through the end of the Cretaceous, a period of approximately 165 million years, was an era of enormous ecological complexity and diversity, populated by hundreds of dinosaur species occupying every conceivable ecological niche, from tiny insectivores to massive sauropods browsing the tops of ancient trees. And crucially for our story, because we are always aware that what matters is not just the individual animals but the ecological systems they inhabited, the dinosaurs were not alone. They shared their world with a menagerie of other organisms whose stories are equally fascinating and whose ecological roles were equally essential to the functioning of Mesozoic ecosystems. Among these co-inhabitants of the dinosaur world were the early mammals, small, mostly nocturnal animals that scurried through the vegetation of Mesozoic environments, eating insects and small prey, avoiding the large dinosaurs that dominated the daylight hours. These early mammals were the survivors of the synapsid lineage, the descendants of the therapsids that had dominated the Permian world, reduced by the end Permian extinction and again by the diversification of the archosaurs, to small, ecologically marginal creatures clinging to the fringes of a world that was not built for them. The early mammals were remarkable animals in ways that their small size and seemingly subordinate ecological position might obscure. They were warm-blooded endothermic, capable of generating and maintaining their own body temperature through metabolic processes. They had highly differentiated teeth, incisors, canines, premolars, and molars, each with specialized functions, representing the culmination of the dental differentiation that had begun with the first synapsids of the Permian. They had large brains relative to their body size, significantly larger, on average, than the brains of comparably sized reptiles. And many of them, possibly most, were nocturnal, a lifestyle that had driven the development of exceptional hearing and a highly refined sense of smell. These characteristics, endothermy, complex dentition, large brain, acute non-visual senses, were not merely features that allowed early mammals to survive in the ecological shadow of the dinosaurs. They were the seeds of future dominance. When the dinosaurs disappeared, when the asteroid impact at the end of the Cretaceous period 66 million years ago brought the Mesozoic era to its abrupt conclusion, it was precisely these characteristics that allowed the mammals to expand explosively into the ecological vacancies left by the dinosaurs' departure. But that story, the story of the rise of mammals and the world as we know it, lies beyond the scope of what we are exploring today. Our story is the ancient world before the dinosaurs and the forces that shaped it. And so let us return to the threads we have been following to pick up some elements of this ancient story that deserve more detailed attention. We spoke in part 1 of the transition of life from water to land, the slow, tentative, millions of years long process by which aquatic vertebrates gradually became terrestrial ones. We described Tiktaalik and the earliest tetrapods, the first amphibian-grade animals making their way onto the margins of ancient waterways. But the story of that transition deserves more careful attention because it was not a single event but a complex process with many dimensions, and because the animals that accomplished it were more fascinating, more varied, and more ecologically sophisticated than a brief summary can convey. The earliest true tetrapods, the first animals with 4 distinct limbs, capable in principle of walking on land, appear in the fossil record at the very end of the Devonian period, approximately 365 to 375 million years ago. We have already met Acanthostega and Ichthyostega, those remarkable animals from the ancient rocks of Greenland. But their story, and the story of the environments they inhabited, bears closer examination. Acanthostega is in many ways the most intriguing of the early tetrapods because its anatomy so perfectly captures the transitional nature of the fish to tetrapod transformation. It had 4 limbs, genuine limbs, with distinct upper and lower limb segments and recognizable digits at the end, but those limbs were not well suited to walking on land in any sustained way. The bones were relatively gracile, the joints not optimally arranged for weight-bearing locomotion on a solid substrate, and crucially, the animal retained fully functional internal gills, structures that are unambiguously aquatic respiratory organs. What were the limbs of Acanthostega actually for, if not for walking on land? The current thinking among paleontologists is that the limbs of the earliest tetrapods evolved primarily as tools for navigating complex aquatic environments. The dense, tangled vegetation of shallow freshwater habitats, with their obstacles, their varying depths, their structures that required pushing and maneuvering rather than simple swimming. Limbs that could grip, push, and pull against solid objects would have been enormously useful in such environments, allowing an animal to make its way through thick aquatic vegetation, to position itself precisely for ambush hunting, to hold its position against currents. Land walking, in this view, was not the original purpose of tetrapod limbs. It was a secondary application of an anatomical toolkit that had evolved for a different primary purpose. This is a common pattern in evolutionary history, structures that evolved for one function are later co-opted for a different one, often with further modification. The wings of birds evolved from the forelimbs of their dinosaurian ancestors, which had themselves evolved for purposes other than flight. The middle ear bones of mammals evolved from jaw bones of their synapsid ancestors. Evolution works with what it has, repurposing and modifying existing structures in ways that often seem, in retrospect, almost ingeniously resourceful. Ichthyostega, the companion of Acanthostega in the early tetrapod fossil record, shows somewhat different characteristics. Its limbs appear more robust, better suited to supporting weight on land, suggesting that it may have made more regular excursions onto terrestrial surfaces. But even Ichthyostega was almost certainly primarily aquatic in its lifestyle, spending most of its time in water and venturing onto land only intermittently. The full conquest of land, the point at which tetrapods became genuinely capable of sustained terrestrial existence, came later, through the Carboniferous period, as the basic tetrapod body plan was progressively modified in directions that improved terrestrial locomotion. Limb proportions changed. The connection between the skull and the shoulder girdle, which had been rigid in fish, became more flexible, eventually producing the distinct head and neck of terrestrial vertebrates. The ear became increasingly adapted for detecting airborne sound vibrations rather than vibrations transmitted through water. The sensory apparatus, the locomotor system, and the reproductive biology of the tetrapods were all progressively refined for life in the new environment. This process of refinement was not a smooth, directed progression toward a predetermined goal. It was the usual messy, branching, trial and error process of evolution, with many lineages exploring different solutions to the challenges of terrestrial life, most of them eventually going extinct, some of them leaving descendants that carried particular combinations of adaptations forward into the future. Among the most fascinating of the Carboniferous tetrapod experiments were the animals that would eventually be classified as reptiliomorphs, the group that includes the immediate ancestors of the amniotes, the first fully terrestrial vertebrates. These animals were developing, step by step, the full suite of features that characterize true land animals: more efficient locomotion, improved water conservation, and eventually the reproductive innovation that truly freed vertebrate life from water, the amniotic egg. The ecological world of the early terrestrial vertebrates, the Carboniferous swamp forests and their margins, was itself a remarkable place that deserves more careful attention than it typically receives in popular accounts of prehistoric life. The Carboniferous forests were not simply a backdrop for the animal dramas playing out within them. They were active participants in those dramas, shaping the ecological possibilities available to the animals living in them in fundamental ways. And they were, by any standard, extraordinary environments. The dominant trees of the Carboniferous coal forests, the giant lycopsids, were unlike any trees alive today. Lepidodendron, one of the most abundant of these, grew to heights of 30 to 50 meters on a trunk that was, remarkably, almost entirely bark. The photosynthetically active tissues were concentrated in the upper portions of the plant, where the trunk branched repeatedly into smaller and smaller divisions, each tipped with long, narrow, grass-like leaves. The lower trunk was largely inert, structural tissue rather than living material. The ecological consequence of this architecture was a forest with a very different light environment from modern forests. The dense canopy of the giant lycopsids filtered out most of the sunlight, creating a deep shade at ground level that would have been challenging for photosynthetic plants and profoundly influenced the behavior and sensory adaptations of ground-dwelling animals. In modern forests, the deep shade of a dense canopy drives the evolution of large eyes in ground-dwelling animals, and something similar may have been at work in the Carboniferous coal forests. These forests were not uniformly distributed. They grew most densely in the equatorial and subtropical regions of the Carboniferous world, in environments with high rainfall and relatively stable temperatures. More temperate and seasonal environments supported different plant communities, less dominated by the giant lycopsids, with a greater diversity of other plant groups including seed ferns and early gymnosperms. And at the margins of the forest, in the areas of transition between densely forested swamp and more open, drier environments, were conditions that may have been particularly important for the early evolution of terrestrial vertebrates. These transitional zones offered a combination of resources unavailable in either the aquatic environment or the deep forest interior. They provided both the shelter and moisture of proximity to water and the open, well-lit conditions that could support richer plant communities and, consequently, richer communities of herbivorous invertebrates. For early tetrapods that were still learning to exploit terrestrial resources, these transitional zones may have been the critical staging grounds, the places where the specific ecological demands of terrestrial life were first met and mastered. Within these environments, the food chains of the early terrestrial world were being established for the first time. Herbivory, the eating of plant material by animals, had not always been common in tetrapod communities. The earliest tetrapods were almost certainly predators, as their fish ancestors had been. But through the Carboniferous, herbivorous tetrapods began to appear with increasing frequency and diversity, developing the dental and digestive adaptations needed to process tough, cellulose-rich plant material. This development had enormous ecological consequences. A herbivorous tetrapod is essentially a converter, a machine for transforming plant energy into animal flesh. By consuming plant material and making it available as prey to carnivorous animals, herbivores create a crucial link in the terrestrial food chain, connecting the energy of photosynthesis to the energy budgets of predators. Without abundant herbivores, large terrestrial predators cannot be supported, and without the ecological pressure of large predators, the behavior and evolution of herbivores would be profoundly different. The co-evolution of terrestrial predators and herbivores, an arms race as old as the first animals to walk on land, began in the Carboniferous and has continued through every subsequent geological period to the present day. The basic dynamic is always the same. Herbivores develop defenses against predation, larger size, defensive horns or armor, greater speed, more effective social behaviors, and predators develop more effective means of overcoming these defenses. Each improvement in one drives selection for improvements in the other, and the result, accumulated across geological time, is the extraordinary diversity of predator and prey forms that characterizes the terrestrial vertebrate world. Through the late Carboniferous and into the Permian period, the synapsids, as we discussed in Part 1, became the dominant large vertebrates in terrestrial ecosystems. And among the synapsids, a series of increasingly sophisticated animals appeared that bring us closer and closer to the mammal body plan that would eventually emerge from the devastation of the end Permian extinction. The dicynodonts, the barrel-bodied, beak-jawed herbivores that we met in Part 1 as survivors of the Great Extinction, deserve more attention than we have so far given them. They were not merely survivors, they were one of the most ecologically successful groups of large vertebrates in the history of life. At various points during their long existence, they first appeared in the Middle Permian and persisted into the Triassic. Dicynodonts were among the most abundant large land animals on Earth, dominating herbivore guilds in a way that no single vertebrate group has managed in the modern world. Their success rested on a combination of features that proved remarkably robust across diverse environmental conditions. The toothless beak, or beak with only a single pair of tusks in many species, could process a wide range of plant material, from soft vegetation to tough, fibrous stems. The barrel-shaped body housed a capacious digestive system capable of extracting nutrition from low-quality plant material. And the dicynodonts showed at least some capacity for burrowing, a capability that may have been crucial for surviving the harsh conditions of the end Permian crisis and that provided year-round access to stable microenvironments in the face of surface temperature extremes. The largest of the Triassic dicynodonts, animals like Lysoiscia, discovered in Poland in the early 21st century and described in 2019, reached sizes comparable to modern elephants, making them among the largest land animals of their time. Lysoiscia overturns a previously held assumption that truly large body sizes among synapsids were confined to the Permian period, before the archosaurs rose to dominance. Here was a dicynodont of enormous size, living well into the Triassic, in an ecosystem that was also home to early dinosaur relatives. The dicynodonts, in other words, did not simply shrink and fade as the archosaurs rose to prominence. They continued to evolve, to adapt, to achieve new body sizes and occupy new ecological roles, right up until their eventual disappearance near the end of the Triassic period. The carnivorous synapsids of the Permian and Triassic were equally fascinating and equally important to the story of life before the dinosaurs. The Gorgonopsians, the saber-toothed apex predators of the late Permian, were eliminated by the end Permian extinction, as we discussed, but the predatory synapsid tradition did not end with them. In the Triassic period, a group of carnivorous synapsids known as the cynodonts, whose name means dog-toothed, reflecting their differentiated dentition, continued to diversify and to evolve in directions that increasingly foreshadow the mammals. The cynodonts were in many ways the most mammal-like of all the non-mammalian synapsids. Their teeth were highly differentiated, with incisors, canines, and complex post-canine teeth whose cusps and ridges suggest a level of food processing sophistication that approached that of modern carnivorous mammals. Their skulls showed an increasingly mammal-like architecture, with the temporal opening in the skull, the gap behind the eye socket through which the jaw muscles pass, expanded to accommodate the larger, more powerful jaw muscles that complex food processing requires. Some cynodonts may have been at least partially endothermic, capable of generating internal body heat. The evidence for this comes from several sources. The bone microstructure of some cynodonts shows patterns of rapid growth that in modern animals is associated with endothermy. Some specimens preserve evidence of whisker pits, small openings in the snout bones through which the whiskers of modern mammals are supplied with nerves and blood vessels, which would suggest a highly touch-sensitive face typical of small, nocturnal, warm-blooded animals. And the overall anatomical picture, the upright limbs, the large brain cavity, the complex teeth, paints a portrait of animals with a higher metabolic rate and greater physiological complexity than typical ectothermic reptiles. The cynodonts gave rise, through a series of increasingly mammal-like intermediate forms, to the true mammals, animals with a lower jaw composed of a single bone, the dentary, a distinctive middle ear apparatus derived from bones that had previously been part of the jaw joint and full endothermy. The earliest true mammals appear in the fossil record in the late Triassic, approximately 225 million years ago, small, shrew-like animals that would have been easily overlooked in the ecosystems of their time, but they were there. They were alive, they were warm-blooded, sharp-toothed, probably nocturnal, and carrying within their bodies the evolutionary legacy of hundreds of millions of years of synapsid evolution. They were the survivors of a lineage that had been knocked down again and again by the great catastrophes of geological history, and had gotten up again and continued. The marine world of the Mesozoic era, the world of the ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, and the diversifying sharks and ray-finned fishes, was also the world of one further spectacular group of marine predators that must be introduced before our story is complete. The mosasaurs, large predatory lizards that secondarily returned to the sea during the Cretaceous period, were among the last and in some ways the most spectacular of the marine reptile dynasties. They arose from a lineage of terrestrial lizards, returned to the sea through the same process of secondary aquatic adaptation that had produced the ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, and in doing so evolved rapidly and dramatically into large, powerful marine predators. The mosasaurs were not as ancient in their origins as the ichthyosaurs or plesiosaurs. They appeared relatively late in the Cretaceous period, but they compensated for their late arrival with extraordinary evolutionary speed. Within a geologically brief time of their appearance, mosasaurs had diversified into a wide range of ecological types and sizes, filling many of the predatory roles in Cretaceous marine ecosystems. The largest mosasaurs, animals like Mosasaurus itself and the enormous Tylosaurus, reached lengths of 12 to 15 meters or possibly more, making them among the largest marine predators in Earth's history. These were animals of substantial power and presumably significant intelligence, given the large brains that characterized their close relatives, the monitor lizards. They were the dominant apex predators of many Cretaceous marine environments, hunting large fish, other marine reptiles, sea turtles, and possibly even the large ammonites, the coiled cephalopods that were abundant in Cretaceous seas. The mosasaurs also show us something important about the speed at which evolution can operate when selective pressures are strong. From relatively small terrestrial lizard ancestors, natural selection produced enormous marine predators in a geological timeframe that, while still long by human standards, is remarkably brief when measured against the full scope of Earth's history. The body was transformed, the limbs became flippers, the tail developed a vertical fin for propulsion, the skull was modified with flexible joints that allowed prey to be swallowed whole, the nostrils migrated toward the top of the skull for breathing at the surface. This is not the work of a single mutation or a single selective event. It is the cumulative result of millions of generations of selection, each small change building on the previous ones, each improvement in aquatic capability conferring a survival advantage that biased the genetics of the next generation. The mosasaurs, like the ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs before them, perished in the Great Extinction at the end of the Cretaceous period. The asteroid impact that ended the age of dinosaurs also swept away the magnificent marine reptiles of the Mesozoic, along with the ammonites, many groups of fish, and enormous numbers of other marine organisms. The oceans that survived the end Cretaceous extinction were stripped of their apex predators in the marine as well as the terrestrial realm. But before we reach that final catastrophe, which lies at the boundary between the story we are telling and the more familiar story of the modern world, let us step back and reflect on the broader patterns that emerge from the ancient history we have been exploring. We have traveled from the Cambrian Explosion to the end of the Mesozoic era, a journey of almost 500 million years. We have met extraordinary creatures at every step, the bizarre experimenters of the Cambrian, the giant cephalopods of the Ordovician, the armored fish of the Devonian, the giant amphibians and early synapsids of the Carboniferous and Permian, the marine reptiles and early dinosaurs of the Triassic and Jurassic. We have witnessed the evolution of eyes, the conquest of land, the invention of the amniotic egg, and the development of endothermy. We have watched ecosystems be built, destroyed, and rebuilt again and again across the immensity of geological time. What are the lessons of this journey? What does the ancient world teach us about life and about the processes that have shaped the living planet? The first and perhaps most fundamental lesson is the lesson of time. Nothing in human experience prepares us to truly grasp the depths of geological time, the almost incomprehensible lengths of time over which the processes we have been describing unfolded. The Cambrian Explosion, that supposedly sudden burst of evolutionary creativity, unfolded over tens of millions of years. The transition from aquatic fish to terrestrial tetrapod required tens of millions of years. The recovery from the end Permian extinction, the rebuilding of ecological complexity after the Great Dying, took millions of years just to establish its foundations. These are timescales so vast that human language can only gesture at them, not truly convey them. But understanding them, or at least accepting them intellectually, is essential to understanding why the living world is as complex and as diverse as it is. The richness of life on Earth is not a quick or easy achievement. It is the product of hundreds of millions of years of evolution, selection, extinction, and renewal. It has been earned in a sense, though of course evolution is not a directed process, and there is no earning in the intentional sense. The second great lesson of the ancient world is the lesson of contingency. The history of life is not a story of inevitable progress toward predetermined goals. It is a story full of accidents, of chance events that redirected the trajectory of life in ways that could not have been predicted. The asteroid that ended the Cretaceous, the volcanic eruptions that triggered the end Permian extinction, the specific environmental conditions that happened to preserve the Burgess Shale organisms in such exceptional detail, these are not the expressions of some overarching plan or direction. They are contingencies, accidents of history, whose occurrence shaped the subsequent history of life in profound and unchosen ways. If the end Permian extinction had not occurred, or if it had been slightly less severe, the synapsids might have continued to dominate terrestrial ecosystems, and the archosaurs might never have had the opportunity to diversify into the dinosaurs. If the end Cretaceous asteroid had not struck, or had struck at a slightly different angle or in a slightly different location, the dinosaurs might still be alive, and the mammals might still be small, nocturnal, ecologically marginal animals. Every organism alive on Earth today, every species, every ecosystem, every ecological relationship, is the product of a specific and unrepeatable historical sequence of events. Change any of those events and the living world would be different in ways we cannot predict. The third lesson is the lesson of resilience, of life's fundamental, stubborn, almost miraculous tendency to persist in the face of catastrophe. The end Permian extinction eliminated more than 90% of marine species and severely reduced terrestrial diversity, and yet life survived. It survived in forms reduced and diminished and ecologically simplified, but alive. And from those survivors over millions of years it rebuilt, not the same world, never the same world, but a world of comparable complexity and diversity, a world teeming with life that found new solutions to the old problems of existence. This resilience is not mystical or supernatural. It is simply the product of the extraordinary diversity that evolution produces. In any large, diverse collection of organisms, some will happen to possess whatever combination of traits is needed to survive a given set of catastrophic conditions. The extinction events that have punctuated Earth's history are terrible, and their victims are real and their losses are genuine. But they have never eliminated all life because life is too varied, too broadly distributed, too flexible in its approaches to survival to be entirely extinguished by any single catastrophe. Now let us return one final time to the recovery from the end Permian extinction, because it is in this recovery that the seeds of everything familiar in the subsequent history of life were sown, and because the story of how life rebuilt from the ruins of the Great Dying is itself one of the most instructive and compelling narratives in the entire history of our planet. We left the early Triassic world in a state of ecological impoverishment. Lystrosaurus and a handful of other stress-tolerant survivors were rebuilding terrestrial communities from near scratch. The oceans were similarly depleted, their complex ecological structures in ruins. The world was simpler than it had been in hundreds of millions of years, stripped back toward the ecological basics by the most severe biological catastrophe in the history of complex life. Recovery in the oceans began modestly, with the expansion of the surviving organisms into the ecological space left by the extinct ones. Fish, particularly the ray-finned fish, a group whose ancestors had been present since the Devonian, but which now found themselves with relatively few competitors, diversified rapidly in the early Triassic. The bivalves mollusks with two-part shells, including the ancestors of modern clams and mussels, expanded dramatically, partly filling the ecological roles previously occupied by the devastated brachiopods. Ammonites, the coiled cephalopods that would become so abundant and diverse in the Mesozoic seas, rebounded rapidly from the handful of lineages that had survived the extinction. On land, the recovery was shaped by the interplay between the surviving synapsids, still represented by groups like the dicynodonts and cynodonts, and the diversifying archosaurs that were beginning their rise to dominance. For much of the early and middle Triassic, this was genuinely a contested ecological space. The outcome was not predetermined. The archosaurs did not simply walk in and take over. They had to earn their dominance through the ordinary processes of ecological competition, generation by generation, as natural selection tested different strategies and different body plans against the realities of the recovering Triassic world. What gave the archosaurs their edge in this competition? Several factors probably contributed. Their locomotor efficiency, the more upright posture, and the improvements in limb mechanics that characterized the group, gave them advantages in sustained movement that the more sprawling synapsids could not match. Their respiratory systems appear to have been more efficient than those of their competitors. Some archosaurs, and certainly the later dinosaurs, possessed a system of air sacs connected to the lungs that allowed a more complete cycling of air through the respiratory system with each breath, extracting more oxygen per unit of air than the tidal breathing systems of mammals. These physiological advantages, combined with the ecological opportunity created by the end Permian extinction, allowed the archosaurs to gradually assert dominance in terrestrial ecosystems through the Triassic. By the late Triassic, the dinosaurs, emerging from the broader archosaur radiation, were beginning to achieve the ecological prominence that would characterize the Mesozoic era. And the synapsids, though still present and still evolving, were increasingly confined to ecological niches that the larger dinosaurs did not fill, specifically the small body-sized niches of the nocturnal, insectivorous early mammals. This is one of the great ironies of evolutionary history. The synapsids, the group that had dominated terrestrial ecosystems in the Permian, that had come within a hair's breadth of establishing the mammal lineage as the dominant large animals on Earth, were squeezed into ecological marginality by their archosaur competitors in the Triassic, and remained in that marginal position for over 150 million years. For 150 million years, the mammals were small, nocturnal, ecologically subordinate creatures, while the descendants of their competitors dominated the world. And yet those small, nocturnal mammals were not stagnating. They were evolving. They were refining the endothermic metabolism, the complex brain, the sensitive hearing and olfaction that would eventually become their greatest advantages. They were developing, in the shadows of the dinosaurian world, the physiological and neurological toolkit that would allow them to inherit the Earth when the dinosaurs were gone. The story of life's locomotion through geological time, the way animals move, and how that movement has evolved, is itself a fascinating thread that runs through everything we have discussed. And in the period following the great extinctions, new approaches to movement were among the most significant evolutionary innovations. In the ancient Cambrian seas, movement was largely swimming, drifting, and crawling, the locomotion of soft-bodied organisms and early arthropods in a world without powerful currents of predatory pressure driving the evolution of speed. As predation intensified and the arms race between hunters and prey accelerated, faster and more maneuverable locomotion became increasingly valuable, and the evolution of more efficient swimming mechanisms accelerated in response. The transition to land introduced entirely new locomotor challenges. Moving on solid ground requires the body to support its own weight, a challenge that doesn't exist in water, where buoyancy does much of the structural work. The early tetrapods, as we discussed, moved with a sprawling gait that placed relatively large horizontal forces on the limbs, forces that required the muscles to do significant work simply to prevent the body from sinking to the ground with each step. This was energetically costly, and it limited the speed and endurance of the earliest land vertebrates. Over time, natural selection favored increasingly upright postures that positioned the limbs more directly beneath the center of gravity, reducing the horizontal forces on the limbs and dramatically improving locomotor efficiency. This improvement unfolded multiple times independently in different vertebrate lineages, in the Archosaur line leading to the dinosaurs, in the Therapsid line leading to the mammals, and in various other reptile groups. It is a beautiful example of convergent evolution, different evolutionary pathways arriving at the same general solution to the same fundamental physical problem. The most extreme form of this locomotor evolution in the pre-dinosaurian world was the development of bipedality, walking and running on just two legs. Among the dinosaurs, bipedality was widespread and occurred across multiple independent lineages. But the roots of bipedal locomotion reach back into the Archosaur evolution of the Triassic period, where several groups independently developed the ability to move primarily on their hind legs. The advantages of bipedality in a terrestrial predator are significant. By freeing the forelimbs from locomotor functions, bipedality allows them to be used for other purposes, grasping, manipulating, and seizing prey. A biped also typically has longer strides relative to its body size than a quadruped of comparable dimensions, potentially allowing higher speeds. And the upright posture of a biped provides an elevated vantage point for surveying the environment, an advantage for both predators scanning for prey and prey animals watching for approaching danger. The evolution of bipedality in the Archosaur line was one of the key developments that allowed the dinosaurs to become the dominant terrestrial vertebrates of the Mesozoic. And it is a development whose roots lie firmly in the Triassic recovery from the end Permian extinction, in the ecological competition and evolutionary innovation of a world rebuilding from catastrophe. As the Triassic gave way to the Jurassic and then the Cretaceous, the world that had been so thoroughly destroyed by the end Permian extinction was rebuilt into something of extraordinary richness and complexity, different from the Permian world, built on different ecological foundations, dominated by different groups of organisms, but comparable in its overall ecological diversity and sophistication. The Jurassic and Cretaceous seas teemed with life. The ray-finned fish that had diversified through the Triassic continued to evolve in extraordinary variety. The marine reptiles, ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, and eventually mosasaurs, occupied the apex predator roles in marine food chains. The sharks, those ancient and conservative predators, continued their long evolutionary history with the relatively modest changes that characterize a body plan already well adapted to its ecological role. And the ammonites, those coiled cephalopods, diversified into hundreds of species, occupying a remarkable range of ecological roles from small predators to large, probably slow-moving grazers. On land, the dinosaurs achieved the ecological dominance for which the Mesozoic era is famous. The great sauropods, those long-necked, enormous-bodied herbivores, consumed vegetation with an efficiency of scale that no terrestrial animal before or since has matched. The theropods, the bipedal, mostly predatory dinosaurs, evolved into a staggering diversity of forms, from the tiny, feathered insect-catching maniraptorans to the enormous, bone-crushing tyrannosaurids. The herbivorous ornithischians, including the armored ankylosaurs, the horned ceratopsians, and the duck-billed hadrosaurs, developed the diverse defensive and ecological strategies that made them the primary herbivore component of many Mesozoic terrestrial ecosystems. And running through all of this dinosaurian diversity, hidden in the undergrowth and the night, the early mammals continued their quiet evolution, preparing, generation by generation, for a future that was still more than 150 million years away. Let us speak for a moment about what the ancient world tells us about the nature of ecological communities and why the collapse of those communities, through mass extinction and other catastrophic events, matters so profoundly. An ecological community is not simply a collection of individual species. It is a network of relationships, predator and prey, competitor, parasite and host, plant and pollinator. Each species in the community influences the survival and behavior of multiple other species through these relationships, and those influences ripple through the network in ways that are often indirect, complex, and difficult to predict. Remove one species from the network, and the effects may propagate outward in unexpected ways, changing the abundance and behavior of species several steps removed from the original removal. The ancient communities we have been studying, from the reefs and invertebrate assemblages of the Cambrian and Ordovician seas, to the synapsid-dominated ecosystems of the Permian, to the marine reptile worlds of the Mesozoic, were all networks of this kind. They were complex, interconnected, mutually dependent, and when mass extinctions struck, they did not merely remove individual species from these networks. They disrupted the networks themselves, severing ecological relationships that had been built up over millions of years, collapsing food chains, eliminating the physical habitats created by reef builders and burrowing organisms, destabilizing the chemical cycles that had been maintained by the metabolic activities of billions of individual organisms. This is why the recovery from mass extinctions takes so long, why the geological record shows millions of years of ecological impoverishment following each major extinction event. It is not merely a matter of waiting for new species to evolve to fill empty niches. The ecological networks themselves must be rebuilt, the complex webs of interaction that allow species to coexist, to sustain one another, to create the stable conditions in which further ecological complexity can develop. This rebuilding requires not just the presence of individual species, but the establishment of relationships between them, and those relationships can only develop through the lived experience of organisms interacting with each other generation after generation. The lesson for understanding the living world, the world that exists today, that was built on the ancient foundations we have been exploring, is profound. Every ecological relationship in the modern world has a history. Every predator-prey interaction, every mutualistic partnership, every competitive dynamic is the product of evolutionary and ecological processes stretching back across enormous depths of time. The world as it exists today is not a starting point. It is a current position in a journey that began in the ancient Cambrian seas. As we draw our journey through the ancient world toward its conclusion, there is one more dimension of this story that demands attention, a dimension that connects the ancient world most directly to the living world of the present. Throughout the 500 million years of complex animal life that we have been exploring, certain fundamental processes have been at work, processes so consistent, so universal in their operation, that they appear again and again in every geological period, in every ecological context, in every part of the world. These are the processes that define life itself: natural selection, genetic inheritance, ecological interaction, and the slow but inexorable accumulation of evolutionary change. The creatures of the Cambrian seas were subject to the same fundamental evolutionary processes that govern the diversity of life today. Anomalocaris hunted with eyes shaped by natural selection, operating on variations in visual acuity and hunting success. The trilobites evolved their defensive spines through the same mechanism by which the porcupine evolved its quills. The first amphibian climbing onto dry land was driven by the same fundamental drive, or rather, the same selective pressure that drives any animal toward environments where resources are available and competition is manageable. What has changed over 500 million years is not the mechanism of evolution, but the products of that mechanism, the accumulated diversity of life forms, the increasing complexity of ecological communities, the ever-broadening range of environments that life has managed to colonize and make its own. And what this means is that the ancient world is not truly past. It lives in the present, in every gene that was first shaped in a Cambrian organism, and has been inherited through an unbroken chain of reproduction to every living animal on Earth today. The genetic code that encodes the proteins in your cells is the same code that encoded the proteins in Anomalocaris, in the earliest fish, in the first tetrapod that pulled itself onto dry land. The biochemical machinery of life, the cellular mechanisms of energy production, genetic replication, protein synthesis, are the same in you as in every organism on Earth because they were inherited from the ancient common ancestors of all life. You carry the ancient world within you. The bones of your hand, the radius, the ulna, the carpals, the metacarpals, the phalanges, are the same bones in a modified form that the first tetrapods developed 375 million years ago. Your eyes, those extraordinary organs that you are using right now to read these words, are the distant descendants of the light-sensitive patches that first gave Cambrian organisms an advantage in detecting their environments. Your jaw, your inner ear, your capacity for endothermy, all of these trace their ancestry to the ancient synapsid lineage that dominated the Permian world and survived its greatest catastrophe. The ancient world did not end. It transformed. The extraordinary creatures of the ancient seas and the primordial lands are gone, but they are not without legacy. They are present in every living organism on Earth, encoded in DNA, expressed in anatomy, reflected in the ecological relationships and biological processes that continue to shape the living world today. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of the journey we have taken, deeper than any specific fact about Anomalocaris or Dimetrodon or the end Permian extinction. The lesson is continuity. Life on Earth is one continuous story, not divided into separate chapters that begin and end independently, but a single, unbroken narrative stretching from the first self-replicating molecules in the ancient ocean, through the Cambrian Explosion and all the extraordinary events that followed, to the astonishing diversity of the living world today. Every mass extinction was a trauma, not an ending. Every recovery was a beginning, not a restart. The thread of life runs continuously through all of it, fraying at times to near breaking, but never quite severing, never quite ceasing. The world before the dinosaurs, the world that took 500 million years to build, that was shaped by forces operating on scales of time and space that dwarf anything in human experience, was not a mere prelude to the familiar story of the Mesozoic era. It was a world in its own right, rich and strange and extraordinarily diverse, populated by creatures of breathtaking variety and ecological sophistication. The Cambrian seas, with their experimental menagerie of bizarre body plans, were not a rough draft of the living world. They were the living world as it existed at that moment in time, real and vital and fully itself. The giant armored fish of the Devonian, the coal forest ecosystems of the Carboniferous, the synapsid-dominated communities of the Permian, these were not practice runs for a future that had not yet arrived. They were the present, fully realized, as complete in themselves as any moment in the history of life, and they matter. They matter because they happened, because they were real, and because their reality left permanent marks on the history of life that can be read in the rocks, in the genetic code, in the anatomy of every living animal. They matter because understanding them deepens our understanding of what the living world is and how it came to be. They matter because the questions they raise about the nature of evolutionary processes, about the fragility and resilience of ecological systems, about the role of catastrophe in shaping biological history, are questions of enduring relevance. The ancient world before the dinosaurs is not a curiosity. It is not merely a collection of interesting fossils and spectacular creatures. It is the foundation of everything that came after, the deep history of a living planet, working out the fundamental problems of existence through hundreds of millions of years of trial, error, catastrophe, and renewal. The fish that first crawled onto land, trembling, gasping, moving its muscular fins against the solid ground of a Devonian riverbank, had no idea what it was beginning. The synapsid that sheltered in a burrow burrow through the worst of the end Permian catastrophe, surviving on whatever scraps remained in a world that had nearly ceased to exist, had no awareness of the significance of its persistence. The early mammal, small and nocturnal, moving through the darkness of a Jurassic forest, had no comprehension that its descendants would one day inherit the earth. And yet here we are, inheritors of all of it, carrying within our biology the legacy of every one of those moments. Walking on limbs that first evolved in ancient seas, seeing the world with eyes whose history stretches back to the Cambrian Explosion, thinking with brains whose basic architecture was first sketched out in the synapsids of the Permian world, the ancient world built us. And in understanding that ancient world, in tracing the long, extraordinary, catastrophe-ridden, resilience-tested, endlessly creative history of life on this planet, we understand something profound and essential about what we are and where we come from. The story of life on Earth is the longest story ever told, and it is still being written. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey through deep time. From the Cambrian explosion to the recovery from the great dying, from the first eyes in the ancient seas to the first footsteps on dry land, this is the history that built the living world. If you enjoyed this documentary, please share it with anyone who loves the natural world and its ancient history. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel, so you will be the first to know when our next deep dive into the history of life on Earth arrives. The story continues, and there is so much more to explore.